Hey folks, David Stewart here. I am back with a very good friend, Matt Crotts. He's the author of and illustrator of Kyrie, which I have all of them right here actually. So this is not something I'm just plugging because I actually buy Matt's comics and I read them, and my son really likes them. I'm getting a spam, sorry. And my son actually likes them because he's really into like Roman history, and I even have these cool foil, the Wild Tales ones, with some other artists and other writers involved, which is a cool idea of the project. Volume 3 is coming out, so I'm going to go ahead and link that. I had it in the email if you're on the email newsletter. If you're not on the newsletter, you can jump on it, dvspress.com/list, and hop on the mailing list, and I'll keep you appraised of all that stuff. How you doing, Matt?
Yeah, doing great, doing fine. Excited to be here. It's been, I think the last time, the one and only other time we streamed together was I think it was like late 2020 or something.
Yeah, it was like it was around pandemic time. Like the pandemic was just getting into gear, which was weird because like all my business just kind of like changed overnight. So I went from selling lots of audiobooks to selling zero. Like I sold 100 copies of audiobooks 1 month, and 100 before that, and then it was like I sold 2. And then after that, like no audiobooks sold for months and months. It was a really weird change. Like everybody got to invest in audiobooks, and it's like no one bought them for like 2 years.
That's amazing. I thought there was there was a jump in I guess people were watching live streams more or podcasting.
Yeah, people were switching their concept. People were liking audiobooks for their commute, and they all stopped. They all started remoting in, so they stopped listening to audiobooks. It just like the bottom fell out of the market really fast. So it's okay though, because I know since I do my own audiobooks, it's not, it's not a big issue. It's not like I have a bunch of money I have to actually recover from the process in order to get it going. So there's Matt's book. I actually had a book that just released yesterday, so I'm going to link that too. It's called Auspices. It's I don't even know how to describe it. It's mythic fantasy, but classic tragedy. So if you're into tragedy in the classic tradition, like Shakespeare, it is a 5-act Shakespearean tragedy, but also high fantasy. There's always esoteric philosophy in my fantasy books, but I never play it up because I'm always just like, I'm going to see who gets what I'm talking about. Let's see if anyone gets it. I may do some videos on like the themes of the eternal dream and what the hell I'm talking about. With the construction of the world, because it expresses like a worldview of mine, but we'll leave that maybe for another time. Mostly I like to have it in the stories, and it's the stories that come first, and then the themes, maybe you don't have to get what I'm talking about as far as the nature of reality and creation and God in order to understand the stories of the books.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now I recognize that cover. I saw you working on that, and
yeah.
I was actually reminded, I think in Discord, the only shared server we're in, it says we're in a Midjourney together.
Yeah, Midjourney.
Yeah.
So this was created using Midjourney. It's several Midjourney images kind of shopped together to make the overall cover. And this was partly because I was first starting out. I'm like, I'm going to try to make a book cover with this. But I didn't realize you could change the ratio of the image. Like it will construct the image. You really need to do a 2x3 to do a book cover, or it had a bunch of these square images. I'm like, none of these will work, so I just kind of like photoshopped them together into this image that we have here, which is pretty cool. What Midjourney does well, and since I do a lot of Photoshop covers, to me it's no big deal to just get assets that a robot made versus assets that someone photographed and then Photoshop them into a cover. To me, it's like the same thing. Other people are like, well, why don't you hire? I'm like, I would love to hire cover artists to do everything, but I have a release schedule that's pretty tight. Like I like to get things out on time, and I also am very, very cheap. So to hire an artist to do a cover, like a really good painted cover, it can be very expensive, and in some genres it just doesn't work. So to me, I'm okay like doing some quick, whatever gets me quicker to market, I think is good. And to me, it's just a replacement for stock photo. It's not anything special. And I've done some covers that used like a stock photo model and then a AI background, so you get the really crazy, cool textures that AI will do with backgrounds. But you have a photorealistic model on it, so it works good that way. I think a lot of people are afraid of AI art because basically because they see themselves as artists being out of the job, but I haven't seen AI do anything that I would consider real art. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's things that are close, but there's always, like, it can't construct an entire image. You're not going to have, like, a Baroque painting made by an AI right now that's, whoa, this really looks like a masterwork of Jacob Jourdain's with all the saints around Christ. They're like, no, it's not going to do that. It can make maybe one single image of something, and then you can try to make art from that. But it's not good at constructing, like, complex scenes or anything like that. Or like this little scene, It's not going to do this for you. It can't. Like, there's too many elements, it's too confusing to prompt it to do that.
I'm still waiting for someone to come to me with a commission request and just showing me a bunch of AI art as suggestion, like an inspiration board, and saying, can you do something like this? Because I feel like people are probably already getting something like that.
I think, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't know if you know the artist Noah Bradley.
That name sounds familiar.
He was well known because he used to do art for Magic the Gathering for quite a long time. But he got basically completely canceled, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, because he was a creep to some women. Like, he slept with women at conventions years ago. Right, so he did the standard thing that fallen people do at conventions, which is hook up with other people. And he apologized for it. And of course, the nature of cancel culture is that an apology is not a prompt for forgiveness or absolution, but rather an admission of guilt that should signal everybody to double down and attack you harder. So he lost all work. He doesn't even like work in art anymore, except kind of tangentially. He lost all of his. He basically lost his career entirely. But he has a couple of good videos on using AI kind of as a sketch layer to begin a composition. So he'll use AI because he does a lot of landscapes, like a lot of digital landscapes. So he'll use AI to kind of construct a scene, and then he'll use that as like the beginning, and then do an actual composition on top of it, because it will put in a lot of elements. And he's like, this is a replacement for what he called photo bashing, which is basically taking a bunch of stock images, references, sticking them together to come up with your idea of your composition, and then working on top of that as an actual piece of art.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And
I don't think it's equivocating to say that digital artists have already been a lot closer to this than maybe a lot of people have already, than maybe most enjoyers of this art have known about. Because of photo bashing and other efficiency strategies, that make digital art, the go-to approach for most industries. We've already been a lot closer to that. And maybe, I don't know, if people have a moral issue with AI art, I can understand the arguments from both sides, but you'd have to also argue that I think that photo bashing is some kind of cheat or something. And that's
there's actually a fuzzier line, because like, even if we go back 100 years, artists used to copy previous compositions all the time. They copy other people's compositions, they copy their own. So you could find masters that would have the same profile in like 6 different paintings, because it's quicker to just boom, put that profile already worked on, sketch it in, and then we'll paint over it. Or you'd have a whole studio of apprentices that would paint. This was very common in the Baroque period, 16 and 1700s. They'd paint the whole scene, and the master would paint the faces and the hands. And like, that would be part of the contract for the commission. Faces and hands to be painted by the master. And he would be instructing all of these kind of newer artists in the techniques for, he'd be like, we're going to put a person here, you're going to put a person, and they would basically paint the person based off of the master's sketch on a big piece of canvas. Then he'd come back in and do all the details later. Well, did Jacob Jourdain's actually paint this crazy screen? Like, him and like 5 other students did, but it's attributed to him. Like, where's the line? I mean, should we even attribute that to him because he had students doing most of the grunt work for the work? I don't know. Most people who aren't in art don't think about this. They think that art, they have like a, I don't know, Caspar David Friedrich, like going out into the wilderness and painting a beautiful scene all by himself to express his heart, and that's what artistry is. But classically, that's rather novel. That's not what was done a whole lot.
Yeah, it's a trade classically, or just
Yeah.
in pre-modern cultures. It's always been a trade, and it's kind of neat. That's one of the nice things about illustration is that it in some ways, I guess, it's maintained that trade status, which makes some people think it's cheaper or something, or it's you know, I don't know. There's criticisms to that, I suppose, in a modern culture, but I think it's kept its nose cleaner maybe than fine art has.
Yeah.
By that artificial distinction that's happened between fine art and illustration.
Yeah.
Inventing those two new categories, I think illustration's kind of survived better as a result.
I think it survived better as a communication medium for people, like versus fine art where you tape a banana to the wall and you have like a write-up next to it on why it's art. Like, I remember going to this Lego exhibit. Where was it? I want to say it was here in Houston a couple years ago. And like, my son's into Legos. We build like giant Overlord towers with our Legos, and so we're like, let's go see what like people did crazy stuff with Legos. Well, it was people trying to make modern art out of Legos, which is kind of silly. And then what you'd see is like, oh, here's somebody made 4 giant colored skulls. They didn't want you to take any photographs, by the way, and this is why, because most of it was stupid. Right, here's 4 giant colored skulls made out of Legos. Like, okay, and here's like a paragraph on why this is art. To me, that's so many extra layers to what you're trying to do versus just like, here's a story with art that goes with it and illustrations and color and things like that. And I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm crazy about the comic standard that existed for many years, which is like, you have a penciler and an inker and a colorist and a writer and a letterer. You have like 5 or 6 people that are working on any given issue. But it made them pump the stories out. Like, the product existed a lot faster versus somebody kind of, laboring over their single piece of art for a year. Having deadlines and having a direction. Like, I have to draw the faces of these guys, and we're going to put dialogue on them to communicate a story that kind of directs the art towards a final end that makes it really, I don't know, effective, and also lets it exist and come out.
Yeah, it's the American comic industries. It's such a unique, such an unusual space to be. I don't know, to be influenced by, to be reading, to be creating stuff within. Because a lot of those things you're describing, I mean, those are functions of the industry, right? So there's a demand. There's an industrial level demand. So we got to figure out how to build, an assembly line to produce something that everywhere else in the world they're not taking this approach, but we kind of invented this new industrial strategy to handle. That's morally neutral to me. Like, it's just kind of interesting that it's different. And then now we've been doing that for so many decades now with mainstream comics. At least people have an expectation, and now that's kind of like a mark of a legitimate comic in a way. If you've got that assembly line lined up, and even if you got a shoestring budget or something, if you've got a letter and an inker and a penciler, like it feels a little more legitimate.
Yeah.
That legacy kind of strategy that's been exported out from these $1 million companies, and then it's been brought into the indie space, which is, I don't know, it can be a little frustrating, honestly, because I think that comics tend to be just like writing a book. Like, the fewer amount of people involved, the more crisp the vision can be, I think.
Yeah, here's some of Matt's art.
Native. Yeah.
So I actually share that. I think I'm an auteur, and I share the auteur vision. And so that carries over to a lot of things. And this is something I've noticed just kind of in my own exploration of art, and just not just art, but all arts, right? The more cooks you have in the pot, the more the dish becomes something like gray mush or fast food. And I think a perfect example, if we want to look at cinema, we'll contrast two kinds of cinema, right? Like, why is it that Marvel movies are never as good as, like, the first Star Wars movie? And the answer is because there's no auteur vision. It's an assembly line production. It's designed to appeal to the masses. It's designed to hit all these particular marks. There's a certain way that all the dialogue is written. You can almost predict what people are going to say. It's like, there's going to be a snarky line here. Most of the dialogue, rather than being directed towards characterization, is really directed towards either hyping up the tension or relieving the tension through comedy. That's all the dialogue in Marvel movies, and it's really standardized. And there's probably lots of there's writers credited, but the way these companies work is there's usually a bunch of writers in a writer room, and they come up with all these jokes, and then it just kind of gets, you have a lead writer who just kind of chops them all into a script, and that's what you end up shooting. Versus something like Star Wars, like George Lucas had an auteur vision of what he wanted to make. He made it even as he was going, because he had to revise what was possible as he's shooting the movie. He had to cut this and do this differently, and the actor said he didn't like that line, so okay, we'll just rewrite it, or like, I just wrote that dialogue so that I could get this movie made, and I never really thought about whether it was good or not, and so we'll just change it on the fly, like those sorts of things. It's the kind of the opposite of assembly line. Even though there's so many people involved, even in the first Star Wars movie, it's such a big production. There's so many painters, there's so many actors and extras and costume designers, and there's so many people involved with it. But it's all playing to the conductor's beat, which is George Lucas's vision of what's going on. And yeah, Ralph McQuarrie is important. All these people are important to the success of it. They're like the members of the orchestra, whereas Marvel, it's not quite like, it's like more like an assembly line than an orchestra. Like as a composer, you need your concert master to be a great violinist to play your concerto, obviously, and you're going to let him compose the cadenzas and things like that. But it's still fundamentally like your composition, and that's even with something that big. I can see the difference between somebody pursuing their vision and somebody just making a corporate product. It really is the difference between a Big Mac and like a Wagyu beef burger with a perfectly fried egg on top. You know what I mean? Like there's hamburgers and then there's hamburgers.
Yeah. It's funny. Like maybe it makes me wonder. Is that why we've come to like begrudgingly enjoy like even like Star Wars prequels at this point, because they're so bad? Like that's the Kino element maybe.
Yeah,
it's
George's symphony, right? And you can like it or dislike it, but it's his vision on display. It's him realizing his something in his head.
Eccentricities, his insane. Like this does not make business sense. This doesn't even make story sense. But you're getting like an authenticity factor, I guess, to that, where you're like, wow, he really committed to that. He really got he got the shots he wanted from those actors. Like the stuff he put up, like
that's what he wanted.
Said that's a wrap. Yeah, which is kind of that becomes something that you kind of admire, I guess.
Yeah, there's also like speaking of Star Wars, there's kind of a corporate apologist strain. Not the guys who like the sequels, but guys who try to pretend like that George wasn't involved enough in the original movies, that they're successful somehow in spite of George Lucas and not because of him. They're like, oh well, his wife edited the first one. It's like she said that she didn't. Right? Like, it's like, oh, it's only successful because his wife edited it. It's like, she said she didn't, that was all George's editing. He spent months editing and reshooting this movie to get it perfect the way he had it envisioned. And like,
I didn't even hear that.
There's a really popular movie on YouTube that's like, it's disproven by like his ex-wife. You can just go look up what his ex-wife said about it. She's like, oh yeah, George is like, I remember spending a couple minutes with him in the editing room. It's like, she's the reason it's successful, not George. Like, they hate George because he produced things they didn't like after things they did like, which to me is like, I don't, I can criticize Metallica albums, but I don't hate them for making music they want to make. Like there's people who go back like, okay, maybe those first 5 albums were just like the result of better producers. It's like, no, they were making different music at different times. That's all. Not all that I like. It's okay. It's okay to not like the prequels. And it's okay to not like the prequels and still look at them and be like, there's some amazing things in the prequels. There's things in the prequels that are just so different from what cinema would normally produce in terms of visuals, aesthetics, like composition of shots, everything, the whole package, that you can't get something like that without somebody just working completely outside the system. They're really interesting products, even if you don't like them.
Yeah, the most successful indie film franchise in history.
Yeah, and this is the other thing too. People are like, "Oh, indies, you'll never be successful." It's like the most popular video game of all time was made by some Swedish guy.
Yeah, Minecraft. Yeah.
It was made by one guy. One guy made the most popular thing in humanity. Like, just think, it's not even, and the thing is that, like, Notch, he didn't, it's not even like, oh, well, he was like the lead designer. It's like, he made the game by himself. I remember playing it in alpha. He was like the only developer on it. He's the only guy who did it. And then you're playing it, you're like, this game's amazing for what one guy, we were blown away that one guy made the game. Like, it seems so simple on the surface, and then you start playing it, it's like he just kept adding systems until you came up with this crazy game. Where, like, it's a couple of simple elements executed well. And then that's the most popular thing ever.
Yeah, and I almost want to see... I didn't even know that, and part of me wanted, like, I was trying to see, would it been as popular if it didn't have an alpha, and if there wasn't this kind of momentum in the indie sphere to kind of like see what he's doing with that game, and he's developing relationships, and I'm thinking, it probably would have still been that popular, because the end result, that product, when it's launched, does have that crisp vision that's constrained and feels like human-sized, I guess, for what it is. And anything else would have been too blurry of a vision to really be as exciting.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that by having the alpha come out, it was the first of that kind of product on the market, and therefore became very influential. And the thing is, whoever's like the first one gets a huge boost. And so, yeah, you can say, oh, well, I like, what is it? I like Stardew Valley, or I like some of these other games that are inspired by the game mechanics of Minecraft. But they're not Minecraft. Like, Minecraft is it's like, we all say, it's like Minecraft, but, right? Being able to say that it's like yours, but basically means that you've created the archetypical concept of whatever you're going for. So by going out early, he got that huge boost, even though it was a product missing a lot of the systems at first. It had the core systems, and that's what was exciting for people. Oh, someone hears my cat meowing. I saw it in chat. We should pay attention to the chat a little bit.
Oh yeah, hey chat.
All right. Victoria Amat says today is Virgil's birthday. An artist praised as a mentor by Augustine, as a light and glory by Dante, and our classic, the classic of all Europe by Eliot. Virgil is the one who leads Dante through what? Through hell and purgatory? It's been so long. And he can't go to heaven though, right? Yep. That's what it was.
He goes up through the levels. He's got these symbolic levels of heaven.
Yeah.
The heavens.
Yeah, there's 7 or 9. There was how many circles of hell were there? 9 circles of hell and 7 circles of heaven.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I read the Divine Comedy.
That's a good indie work too, right? And,
yeah.
And I think that's the first work of literature in Italian. I think that was where he just kind of said, "I'm actually not going to write this in Latin. I'm going to write it."
Yeah, he wrote it in
people's language.
Somebody called it kind of, I don't know the right descriptor. Somebody called it, when I was studying it, modern Italian. It's modern Italian in the same way Shakespeare's modern English, in that a modern Italian would probably not have the easiest time reading Dante in Italian, because it uses a bunch of conventions that have kind of gone by the wayside, and others that were kind of indicative of the period. But it's readable, It uses Italian words and not You know, it's not like reading Middle English. Middle English is not English. You know, Old English is not English. Anglo-Saxon is not English. Like I enjoy attempting to read Middle English, but it's very apparent when you're reading, you know, Chaucer that this is not written in our language. We're having to sit there and puzzle out what it means. Like, wait a minute, what does this mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so yes.
The chat's having great conversations.
Shady Paradox and Red Wings hockey. I guess hockey started back up. Since I don't watch sports, it's a big kind of blur of nothing to me. Like I meet regular people and they're like, "Oh, did you see whatever game?" I'm like, I can't get broadcast TV at my house. I can't even watch the game. I haven't had broadcast TV in almost 20 years. You know, I don't know. Mm-hmm. It's like, are you a fan of this team? I don't know. I don't know if I'm a fan of them. I don't watch them play sports, so probably not. What's your favorite type of story to write? My favorite type of story to write is this kind of story. I like writing fantasy because I'm not bound by rules and by history. I've written one historical fiction novel, and it required a lot of research. It's Muramasa Bloodbreaker. I don't think I have it on hand. It's maybe behind me somewhere. It's good. I would recommend it for anyone that likes samurai stories because I wanted to write a samurai story. But you have to bind yourself a lot when you write historical fiction, as Matt does, versus I could just write in my own fantasy world and incorporate as much esoteric thought as I want and have the plot go wherever I want. I can make up magic that makes things happen the way I want. So I really like writing fantasy. I also enjoy writing horror to an extent. Horror takes a little bit out of me. There's horror elements in every book that I write, but horror, you know, you spook yourself out writing horror. That's the truth. What about you, Matt? What do you like to write?
For me, I mean, it's definitely historical fiction because I enjoy the scaffolding, you know, that history gives, and then you can kind of weave your vines of fiction on the trellis of what's, you know, between the lines of history. Like that's kind of fun. I admire a lot of people who can actually pull fantasy off so well, like yourself, because you kind of you got to build your own scaffolding and your kind of your play space within that at the same time. That's a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I would say for people who are interested in writing fantasy, you should learn a lot of history because that really informs you as to the way societies work and the way cultures work. Read anthropological work and read history. So history, I think history kind of needs to be mated to some extent with anthropology to understand the context of what's going on. And that's happened a lot with a lot of modern scholarship is like, okay, instead of just writing about what these various Roman generals did in the 3rd century, we're going to also talk about what life was like in the 3rd century and what Romans thought or believed and how that influenced him. Like one of my favorite things to think about with Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar we think of as this military commander, this genius of the battlefield because he was so successful on his military campaigns. But if you were to ask Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar, why are you so successful? He'd say, because I have the favors of the gods, and I have the favors of the god. I have the favor of the gods because I'm very pious. He would say, I hold true to the gods, and I perform the rituals appropriately, and I'm a pious person, and the gods love me. I'm lucky because I have the favor of the gods. He would not say that he's special or smart, or like, here's how I organize the army to be like he did that stuff, but he wouldn't say that. He would first go with like a religious thing. He was the high priest.
Yeah, as the like avatar of Romanism. That kind of like the connection point between the heavens and earth, or Rome. Yeah,
I think that's why the Romans
successful.
It's why the Romans converted to Christianity so quickly and readily, as they were a pious people. They were already a people that were very religious and were very observant of ritual and believed in the world beyond themselves. So the city, of course, it's the city people who converted first to Christianity. A lot of people don't realize this. maybe this, I'm sure you know a lot of this stuff. The word pagan, paganus, and the word heathen basically mean country bumpkin. They mean like hillbilly. So it's an insult to people from outside the city who didn't convert to Christianity. They didn't come to church. They didn't they're out there believing that they can like leave bread in the grove for some god of whatever their grandfather believed in. Like they viewed them as like superstitious bumpkins who like threw salt into wells because they were afraid of ghosts or something. And that's so when people are like, I'm a pagan, it's like that's, the religion of Rome really got replaced with Christianity because the Roman people were already very pious, and so once the conversion reaches a critical mass, then it just kind of everybody just kind of can go with the new thing. Whereas the country people were longer to convert because they didn't perform the state rituals, they didn't have the same level of piety, they lived out in the sticks where they were kind of afraid of monsters. They had a more, I guess, visceral religion, more primitive religion.
I had a thread on Twitter a little while back, and I got some heat for saying this, but I kind of think that Christianity is the new paganism for these same classical reasons. That it's considered by it's more of a rural religion, and that's where the rituals are maintained a bit more, and and it's considered like an antiquated way of interacting with life and with the world. And if you go to the city, you're expected to adopt something that's a little that leaves those countryside traditions behind. But pagans and Christians alike don't want me to say that. But yeah. I think it's kind of interesting that way. I mean, that's just properly defining it the way it used to. Kind of puts a spin on it. But.
Yeah, and it makes sense, like why. Anyway, yeah. So I could totally see that parallel, in that it's the people who are kind of outside of the mainstream of the society who are able to maintain those rituals. So, and I think, the Scandinavians, as an example, they're always kind of held up as this pagan ideal, even though they all converted to Christianity eventually. Why were they so late in conversion? It's because they were really separated from the rest of mainland Europe. It was not easy to get to Scandinavia. You had to go over vast reaches of mountains and forests to get to Denmark and Sweden. You really had to sail there, and so the Viking Age happens when the Vikings decide to get in their boats and sail around. Why were they so long in converting? Well, they were just isolated. They just didn't have that contact. They weren't urbanized. They were still pretty rural. Whereas the rest of Europe had kept developing along these classical lines. Not entirely. There was actually like a big depopulation of the urban centers of Europe that happened leading up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. That historians have a lot of debates about why that happened or how it happened. Like, was it plagues? There was like the Justinian plagues, which may have actually been the first Black Plagues, way back in like the 6th century, which is interesting to think about. And of course, plagues happen in urban centers where people are closely congregating, sharing all their stuff. That's where plagues tend to happen. So anyway, there's a debate as to why this happened. Like Rome at one point had 1 million people, and then in like 800 AD it had like 30,000. It was really bizarre depopulation that happened in Europe. Yet Christianity persisted after it had started in the urban centers. After the urban centers depopulated, Christianity really became very rural as well. There was monasteries, maybe the monastic traditions part of the ruralization of the urbanized Christian belief system. It's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah. It is interesting. Like, there isn't this grand arc that inevitably brings everyone to the cities and keeps them there. It is kind of interesting when you do get that kind of decentralization that can happen, what that looks like.
I'm trying to remember what
Eastern versus West.
I'm trying to remember what emperor it was in the East. It might have been Justinian. I always want to think it's Justinian did everything, but they went around because people were leaving the cities. They went around and were like grabbing people out of the country, like, no, you have to go back to the city. You can't just leave the city and go back to your village and go start villages. People were really like de-urbanizing in a weird way, and I'm not sure why that happened or what the result was. But it was an actual problem that was recognized in at least the eastern part of Europe, in the Eastern Empire. And then
that sounds like Justinian.
Yeah, we also have some interesting archaeological evidence from the remains of Roman baths, particularly in like England and France, where you go down and you're excavating the Roman bath and you're pulling the dirt out, and you find evidence of like fires and like broken pot shards. And why is all this stuff in the bottom of the baths? And the reason is because people were squatting in the baths. The baths had been emptied at some point, and people lived in them as a shelter, right? They squatted in the abandoned Roman baths because there was no one maintained the baths. So there was just this empty building. Why not just go live in it? And so they lived down in the bottom of the baths, where it was provided shelter and warmth, and they could cook things, and it stayed warm in there. If you built a little hearth in the middle of the bath, and you could live in the Roman bath. So really weird to think about, like, oh, this beautiful bath, why was it abandoned? We don't really know, because it was a process that took hundreds of years, but eventually they stopped filling the baths and using them.
Yeah, when you think about my go-to is always the it's pottery wheels. What became a lost technology in Western Europe after the dissipation of the Western Roman Empire. So
yeah, I didn't know about this. You'll have to tell me about it.
Yeah, well, people reverted to basket weaving and stuff like that, or wooden-based bowls and stuff, because that became a technology, like people just didn't have it anymore.
Yeah, I've talked about this as like, how do dark ages happen? And this is always one of those meaty topics in history and in anthropology. How do dark ages happen? Well, technology, you have to think that technology is not technology, right? Like, a book is a kind of technology. A phone's a kind of technology, but it's not just the phone, right? The phone has a bunch of things that are attached to it that are required for you to use it. Same thing with a book as a kind of technology. The book has paper. We have to know how to make the paper. We have to know how to read the words that are inside. We have to know what the words mean and what they're trying to communicate. And we have to know all the context for this book to make any sense. It's a fantasy book. Like, what if somebody 5,000 years from now found the book and they're just like, there's a bunch of letters we can't read, we don't know what it means. Or maybe they know ancient English, but they're like, they don't know anything about what fantasy is. So they're like, is this recording a historical event? Is this some piece of religious mythology? Is this part of some ritual belief that the ancient Americans had? Right? These are the kinds of problems with anthropology and archaeology in general. It's like, you don't quite know what some of these things were. But more importantly, technology is knowledge. You have to know a lot to use the technology. You have to know a lot to continue it. So if there's a potter, if you have a local potter and he dies of the plague, it's Justinian plagues, he dies of the plague, who else knows how to make the pots? If the answer is nobody, and you can't convince somebody from another village to come in and be the potter, the technology's lost. You have to find another way to do business. How did people forget how to smelt and forge steel throughout various parts of Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries? The blacksmiths died, and the apprentice was also, there was no one who knew how to do it. No one knew how to make horseshoes at some point in northern France. People forgot how to make horseshoes. I don't know if that's true, but I know that there's places in Europe where like metalworking was forgotten for like a century because, well, what happened? The only person who knew how to do it died. That's the problem with division of knowledge. Our economy is so built on the division of knowledge. That's the division of labor is really the division of knowledge. Everybody knows how to do something different. That if you lose an entire group of people that know how to do something, the technology's gone. There's not that many people who know how to run a nuclear power plant. If they all died tomorrow, nuclear energy's lost. We just don't know how to continue it because we can maybe try to recover it from books, but we've lost the knowledge. So that's how you lose technology, is you lose the people who know how to do it. And especially in the pre-modern period, most everything was oral. It wasn't, the blacksmith wasn't creating, sometimes they did, but usually they didn't. They weren't writing a book on how to make horseshoes. They taught their apprentice how to make horseshoes, and he continued the trade after them, and maybe made improvements, maybe came up with his own ideas, and over time you develop. Who invented Damascus steel? It's like it was a collective effort of blacksmiths figuring out the best way to make steel. Yeah, Kai points out nobody knows how to make a pencil. It's the parable of the pencil.
Oh, wow.
Very famous economic
Haven't
pencil.
heard that.
No one knows how to make a pencil. I don't have a pencil here, but you can look it up. Just type in the parable of the pencil, and you'll see Milton Friedman explaining this, famous economist. No one makes out what's in a pencil. We have graphite. Well, graphite comes from a mine in Brazil. We have some wood. It comes from a tree in the Pacific Northwest. We have rubber that comes from India. You have steel that comes from somewhere else. I see my son. Hey, Ron, you're going to come show me your costume? You want people to see your costume? What weapon did you get at the yard sale? Oh my gosh, this is so scary.
I got claws and...
You got a crazy hammer.
Yeah, and claws.
What is that?
Awesome.
It's...
He has claws too.
Oh, you have claws too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow, you look scary.
That's great.
Sorry.
I love you. All right. Anyway, I don't remember what I was talking about. Technology or something.
Yeah, lost,
the
lost
pencil.
technology.
Yeah, in order to make a pencil, you got to assemble these materials from all these different places, and then you have to make machines to extract those materials. A saw to cut down the trees, a mining operation to get the graphite and the steel or the aluminum or whatever the little metal bit is, and some technology to extract the latex from the rubber tree and make the rubber, So it's a whole lot of technology. The people from all over the world could hate each other, right? They could be different religions, different creeds, different cultures. They might hate each other, but we have this thing called money, and everybody likes money, so of course you trade. You trade with the people who maybe hate you because, well, they have something you want. So that's the parable of the pencil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there anything? I'm trying to think. Is there anything in storytelling that we're losing? Is there a craft? Are there craft elements to storytelling that we're losing because people specialize too much, and maybe there's different authors that are dying out and genres are suffering? Whole genres are suffering as a result.
That's an interesting thought. I'm not sure. I think what happens is any artistic movement is inspired by, it doesn't start from zero. Like, none of us start from zero, right? Somebody made the universe, and then eventually things continue from that point in time. So no art starts from zero. It starts built on the things that came before it. But any artistic movement may have its own momentum. And so one of the things I could think about it in, visual art's not my highest expertise. It's really music. So I can use heavy metal and jazz as both examples of exactly what I'm talking about. So let's start with jazz because it's a little older and we have a few more years. Jazz no one woke up and decided what jazz was. Jazz was a cultural development in the United States primarily, but it happened in France too as early as the 1920s. So it's not exclusively American. That Americans like to claim it as like the exclusive American thing, but I mean, there's people playing jazz in the 1920s in Europe, which is the exact same time jazz begins here. So who really made jazz? It kind of starts from this blues tradition, which we don't even really know where blues came from. It's a cultural artifact. Lots of musicologists think it comes from Africa. But you go over to Africa, there's this belief that rock and jazz come from Africa, but you go over to Africa and their music is nothing like that. There's no, tonally and rhythmically, it's nothing like rock and jazz. It's something that, I don't know, developed over second half of the 19th century and eventually became this thing that people called jazz. And there's different elements to jazz, improvisation, the use of chords, there's so many things. Over time, jazz becomes its own thing. It's no longer inspired by blues. It's not inspired by folk music. It is its own thing. And rather than referencing Dixieland and blues, it's referencing itself. So then you start to get development of things like hard bop, as an example. Hard bop is pretty early in the development of jazz, but hard bop is the kind of jazz most people are not going to enjoy. Actually, bebop and hard bop. So bebop is like, we're going to make jazz, but not for people to dance to and enjoy, but jazz for other jazz musicians. It's completely kind of inward focused, which is why most people don't really like Dizzy Gillespie's music or Charlie Parker's music as much as jazz guys love Charlie Parker. Your average person you put on Charlie Parker, they're like, I'm done. Turn it off. Or John Coltrane, which is hard bop. So John Coltrane's like, we're going to do bebop, but harder. You know, we're gonna bop even harder. You know, so eventually you end up with things like fusion and free jazz, which are incomprehensible to people who have not already heard 500 jazz albums. So you have eventually you get this form of music where you only understand it because you've listened to hundreds of hours of music that this references for you to even begin to understand what the hell is going on in free jazz, right? Or avant-garde or any of this kind of really crazy jazz stuff. Then you have movements like, well, we're going to go back to the core of what jazz was. Hard bop. It's like, I don't know about that. You know, we're going to do, you know, so in the 80s you started getting kind of revivalism. And you've had this whole cycle. Now, meanwhile, do you know anyone who listens to jazz?
Yeah, well, only practitioners.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
It says something. I don't know any regular people who listen to jazz. Now, my wife and I listen to jazz. We both have music degrees. Right? So that's like every person I met who listens to jazz has a music degree or plays jazz. I don't know any normal people who listen to jazz. That's the way it goes. Now, metal kind of has its own trajectory there. It starts as an evolution from the rock tradition and from blues. Black Sabbath is originally a blues band. Improvisation is heavily present in early heavy metal. So if you listen to any live recordings of Black Sabbath or Rainbow or Deep Purple, any of the early metal bands, there'll be a 15-minute guitar solo that's improvised. Like vocalists are improvising new lyrics on the spot. There's an improvisational tradition. That improvisational tradition gets lost by the 1990s, where guitarists, instead of studying jazz, which influenced Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and Rainbow and Deep Purple, and even Judas Priest started as a blues band. Rather than listening to the jazz and blues which inspired those bands, they listened to Yngwie Malmsteen and copy his solos note for note, not realizing that Yngwie never plays the same solo twice. Right? So they've lost like what created the original music. So you hear these highly refined technical solos which are kind of sound and fury expressing nothing at the end of the day. Like they play it note for note live what they played on the album, only live they make more mistakes because they're not able to do 100 takes to get this highly technical solo correct. And then those same people won't even really think about it when they go see Tony Iommi play live, and they're not hearing anything from the album. It's not even in the same tuning. You know, they're like, we'll just play this one in D because I don't want to switch guitars. You know, originally they recorded a bunch of songs all detuned because Tony Iommi lost his fingers in an accident and couldn't press the strings. So, like, there's all these weird things from metal that just get lost. So the modern metal guys make metal for other metal musicians and for people who are metal fans and who've listened to hundreds of hours of metal. I can't put on a Carcass album for somebody. Occasionally there's a newbie who's like, Carcass, for whatever reason, does it for him. But chances are, for you to get into Emperor or Carcass or any of these extreme bands, you have to have listened to every Metallica album, every Megadeth album, every Judas Priest album 20 times before moving on to Pantera, before eventually settling with like Gorguts or something really crazy, or Autopsy. Like a really extreme band, it's specifically designed to gatekeep normies. Like normies can't understand Carcass. They're intended to not understand Carcass. Normies cannot understand Emperor. It's the whole entire point of the existence of Emperor is that normal people can't listen to it. That's Darkthrone. In fact, Darkthrone's even better. They even explicitly say it. We don't want to be popular. We're not making music. We're making whatever we want to do all the time. They work at the post office, right? Or at least one of them does. He has a day job at the post office. So he doesn't care about the money. He's like, in fact, I make metal specifically to be against the mainstream. I don't do anything people want to listen to. People still like it, but only metalheads. I don't know any normal person who listens to Darkthrone either.
Yeah, these are all new names to me.
Okay, yeah.
I go as deep, like for modern metal, like I only go as deep as like Sabaton or something, and maybe that's
Sabaton's power
that
metal,
could-
very accessible. I love Sabaton. It's my
Yeah.
son's favorite band, probably.
popular level.
Sabaton, Powerwolf, Twilight Force. I'm a huge fan of power metal. Power metal is very accessible because it uses. It's not designed to gatekeep, but it's just a high level.
Yep.
It's just a high level performance of classic metal. But even those guys will play note for note the same solos. They don't stop and have like a 15-minute guitar break in the middle of a live set like the old bands used to do. It's just not part of the way that
Yeah.
they think of metal. They think they've been listening to studio recordings for so long. And the way that they record music too probably is they write the music, they're doing it in Pro Tools. They compose it kind of in a studio fashion and then rehearse it and then take it on the road. It's the exact opposite
Yeah.
of the way Black Sabbath composed music. Even the last album that they did with Ronnie James Dio, the band decided to get back together. They went into their rehearsal space. They all played together for a couple months, came up with 8 songs through that rehearsal and writing together, and then recorded them and then toured with them. So
Oh, wow.
all those songs started live. Every song started with them playing music with each other, not writing stuff down in the studio. Tony Iommi'd have an idea, Geezer'd have an idea, Ronnie'd have an idea, Vinny'd have an idea, and then they just make music out of it. That's the old way, and I loved doing that back in the day. I can't do it anymore because, frankly, I learned through 20 years of musical experience that most musicians just are not capable of working in that way. They really just need to be told what to do. We've completely lost, talking about lost things in art, we've lost the ability for musicians to work together without a highly structured and directed environment. We've lost
Oh, wow.
the jazz tradition. Even if you're going to go study jazz, let's say you want to study jazz at the university level, you're going to be in a big band of 18 people for most jazz instruction with an instructor who's telling you how to play the music, which is the complete opposite of how Miles Davis operated 100 years ago or 90 years ago, where he got the musicians he just wanted to play with and guys he liked and liked their playing, and they got in a room and, oh, Wayne's got a piece, we'll do that, I'm going to write a trumpet part, and then they would just boom, and most of it was improvisational. So they just played with people they like to play with. They just learned to play together, and we've lost that. It's all, and as a band director, I understand it like kind of intimately, because so many programs I go to, the kids are completely focused on it's like musical boot camp. They just have to do whatever the instructor tells them to do, and that's what they have to do. And they can't compose new music. They can't work on their own. They can't work together on their own. That kind of artistry has been lost. So maybe that answers your question. Oh, that's a long rant there.
No, that was fascinating. There was a distributionist stream a couple months ago. He had on a musician, and he was talking about how it was like a session musician type guy who was talking about how he doesn't think music really is getting made as much anymore because during break sessions, or when you're not even, when your part isn't being recorded or something, you're in studio but you don't have the instrument in your hand, you're probably picking up your phone now at this point, or you're like subdividing and you're outsourcing that brain space power somewhere else, and you're not just kind of listening and thinking and reflecting on the music when you're not playing. So folks, they have this like ADHD approach to even just sitting in studio. So you're just not getting the quality that you could have just even 10 years ago, which is really depressing if that's true. I mean, that's his anecdotal experience.
I can 100% see that as now I'm not in the studio anymore, so I don't know this firsthand, but that's definitely a possible thing. You know, we're not as good at multitasking as we think we are. A lot of times we think we're very good at multitasking, but in reality what we're doing is we get bored easily, and so we just like to have many distractions available to us rather than multitasking. It's something I've learned personally as a professional. If I'm trying to write a book, I will put music on, but it's not to listen to the music. It's because I have such severe tinnitus. If I don't have noise in the room, I have moments of insanity from the ringing in my ears. It's very hard to go to sleep right now because I'm completely deaf, but like I like lost the hearing in my other ear. So when I take my hearing aid off and like lay down to go to sleep, mainly what I hear is and I'm like 100 frequencies, and it's like I have to like pray and meditate for 30 minutes before I can even hope to be tired enough to go to sleep. It's really bizarre. Anyway, yeah, so you just start distracting yourself with something else, which means you're not attentive to what you're supposed to be doing. The smartphone is an amazing tool, and I use it for lots of things. But one of the things I'm trying to do personally to develop a healthier use of smartphone is knowing when it's okay for that distraction and when you need to not allow that distraction to intrude upon what you're doing. So if you're going to the bathroom, I don't see any problem with like whipping out your phone and looking at Twitter, right? What else? I mean, do you really need to focus on pooping?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? It's an automatic thing, or go and pee or something, right? Or if you're doing something that's kind of mindless, like if I'm hammering in the nails, I'm building a fence and I'm putting up the fence boards. Do I need to think about, but even then, if you were to turn off your audiobook, listen to the sounds of nature, you might find God in just hammering nails. People don't think of that. They're like, I got to fill up my mind. I got to be keeping every single second of my life kind of high upkeep what's the word? Uptime? Like I have to be effective with every moment of my life. And that may not be healthy. I see that. Yeah. I can see that with musicians.
Maybe there's upside, like maybe people are going to write different music, in the coming years and decades because of that kind of high upkeep wavelength that people are operating in.
Yeah.
Like maybe for their whole lives at this point, there's going to be musicians they spent 50 years constantly distracting themselves. So maybe, I don't know, maybe they'll come up with something that's actually kind of interesting and innovative as a result.
Yeah, we don't really know, but I think one thing you lose is like the way oral transmission has to work is you need a speaker and a listener. And so if you're on your phone, you're not listening to the oral transmission. I would actually argue that oral transmission of information has actually exploded over the last 10 years, but not in ways that people traditionally think about it. So they think about oral transmission of knowledge as like I go in and I listen to my priest talk, or I go and the blacksmith tells me how to hammer things, and that's oral transmission of knowledge. And that still happens, right? Like you go to church, you should listen to your priest talk, right? You shouldn't be reading books during the homily, hopefully. And if you feel they need to do that, maybe there's something else you need to think about. Anyway, but we're on YouTube. So we are engaging right now in the oral transmission of knowledge. We're two gurus talking to an audience of people. And YouTube and the internet is facilitating those people to congregate around us and ask us questions, even though I'm not paying attention to the chat very good. So I apologize.
Yeah, sorry, chat.
To congregate around us and listen to our wisdom and listen to what we're saying. This is I don't want to put it in. I always go back to like religious framing, but it would be like, oh well, here's this monk from Greece, and then he's visiting France, and then there's two monks talking to a bunch of acolytes, right? Like that would be an interesting experience, and the acolytes would all pay attention. Well, we can facilitate that on massive scales with YouTube. Right, it would be there'd be so much to learn. Like, oh, this person has a different perspective, and they're telling it to me directly in a conversational manner that I'm used to uptaking information in, rather than reading it from a book. The other thing about oral transmission, you notice, I make fun of this because there's some podcast where they'll talk about a movie. They'll talk about a 2-hour movie for 11 hours. Like, you got to go on this podcast. I'm like, I don't have time for that. Right, I can't do that. That's way too much for me. Way too much. But That's kind of the oral transmission of knowledge. If we look at, say, the epistles of St. Paul constantly references what he already taught them, right? He spent months living with these people. How much information did he actually impart to the church he founded by living with them for months? It's incomprehensible. It's so much more versus this tiny epistle that it's little. He already left. He's like, let me write you. I got to correct your behavior. So I'm going to write you this letter to tell you how to live and to remind you that I already told you a bunch of things, right? So oral transmission is voluminously larger than a book. When you write a book, and I did this with the creativity book, I was like, how small can I make the book? You have to exclude tons of knowledge. There's literally 300 hours of YouTube, me telling people how to be creative. I had to distill that into a 35,000 word book. What is the essential knowledge, and discard everything else? And I think it was Gospel of St. John. It's like the if I included everything, it would fill all the books in the world, you know. Which at that time there weren't that many books, so that's totally believable, you know. But the point is that it's like I selected the important things so that you would believe Christ is the Son of God, not everything he did. This is just like a tiny, tiny fraction of the things he did in front of us and to us and taught to us, you know. So we've had an explosion of oral teaching, but we don't think of it as oral teaching because it's back and forth the way it classically would have been. We have an acolyte talking to his superior, asking questions, rebuking him sometimes, in order to gain the knowledge, in order to ferret out what the true path is. So we have a big resurgence of that, but we don't think of it that way because it's YouTube and it's entertainment. It's like, no, this is oral transmission of knowledge. We're doing it right now.
Yeah, I've seen, I remember linguists talking about 10 years ago about the emergence of what was then, you know, it was the new phenomenon of Twitter, and how, you know, typing like LOL is the indication that we're actually using spoken language even when we're typing. There's a register we're using we're talking with each other in a way, as opposed to like 150 years ago, like Abraham Lincoln when doing his stump speeches, he would talk like he writes.
Yeah.
And now we actually write the way we talk, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
maybe that's like a natural pushback against the over technologicalization, maybe. And maybe we're trying to balance that, you know, with the oral culture.
Mm-hmm. I think these things go both ways. That this was a criticism against, I think, St. Augustine. His original opinion of the writings of the New Testament, the Gospels, is that they were like written stupidly, right? Like it was written in this lowbrow Greek, and it wasn't. You know, he was used to the classical writing, and it would be like reading something written by a 7th grader. You know, that's the best way I can put it.
It's not Virgil. Yeah.
Right? He's like, oh, this is just, it's not good. And now he was eventually converted, obviously, but the point is that the evangelists of the first century were not preserving those things to be poetic, but rather because they were just trying to preserve the knowledge. They had spent their time teaching orally, as Jesus did. Jesus didn't sit down and write a book for them and say, here's the gospel. Now you have the book that I wrote, now go forth. He taught it to them with words, with his voice. And we know that Jesus had a extreme potential to move hearts with his words and with his speech. These are very important things. We should not underestimate how important speech is and how important words are. Because there was a point where, like, what gospel was it? They sent people to go get Jesus, and they came back empty-handed. Like, where is he? It's like, no one talked like this man. You know? Like, you don't understand. Like, we couldn't, like, his speech was so powerful, they were unable to lay hands on him. They were completely convinced by his ability to talk to them. Like, this is, speech has power, words have power. God said, let there be light, and there was light. The universe is spoken into being. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Language is so important, and speech is so important. And words coming out of our mouths, we're given an organ to speak. Now, our hands can write. Our minds can turn that into writing. But we're not created with writing in mind. We're not created automatically to write. It's a technology we've invented so that we can pass on our speech in a way that's beyond our normal ability of ears to hear. If I write a letter, I can send it to someone who's past my ability to hear. If I write a letter, I can send it to someone in the future. So if I write a book, when I write my book, I'm telling a story to people in the future. I wrote this book in the past, but you're reading it in the future. So when you write things down, you're taking your speech, you're sending it to the future, or you're sending it to somebody outside of the range of the hearing. But it all comes back to this thing that we're given to speak with. It's not purely symbolic. Like, it's easy to say, well, the speaking is symbolic. Maybe not. Maybe he actually spoke a word and it existed. Like that these things are real because we speak things into existence. Now we're getting into the esoteric philosophy that underpins this book and every fantasy book I write, if you look deep enough into it, which is that we are creators in our own way too. We create ideas. We take ideas, we reformulate them. I'm in a house. You're in a house. You're in a building of some kind, right? Buildings don't spring out of the ground. They're made by people with technology. They're an idea that a person makes and then takes the things that God made on earth and reconstructs them into a form of a house. Cuts down a tree, makes wood, builds the walls, makes all these things that exist in a house. Metal, sheetrock, everything that's in a house, electricity to power it. All of these things are ideas that people create. We've created the house. Human beings have. Just as God creates earth. And how do we know how to make the house? Is we tell other people how to make it. The knowledge, the existence of the idea is transmitted through language.
Yeah, it sounds very Platonic, but you're relying on language as the medium, which is that's really fascinating. Yeah. I like it a lot.
Let's check out the chat. If you ever had the chance to work on the soundtrack for any game or movie, what would it be? Well, at this point, I'm not really physically capable of working on music because I can't really hear it. But I don't know. It's hard to say. Based on the kind of music I do, it would be something like Elder Scrolls because I tend to write a lot more ambient music. And I like the mood of that music, and I like the way it functions within the game a lot better. I feel like Elder Scrolls has some of the best functioning music in video games. Whereas other music, it's just kind of background. In Elder Scrolls, it like lines up with you doing certain things. You enter combat, you get a combat music. You exploring a cave, you get a spooky cave music. Like it kind of goes along with what you're doing in the game to like bring out the mood of Elder Scrolls. And so something like that I think I'd really enjoy.
Do you think that I always imagine that people who have jazz experience would enjoy a video game composition more because you can just, you're not trying to tell a story with your music so much,
Mm-hmm.
You're just trying to capture a vibe, I guess. It's less linear, so maybe, I don't know, it's something I've always thought.
Yeah, I had a friend who did it. He worked for Konami.
Oh, well.
And he did that for a while, and he ended up not enjoying it because he wanted to compose very thoroughly rather than just make something that would be looped. Like, well, we'll take this 30 seconds and loop it. He wanted to be involved in a more thorough idea of composition. Yet, I love Jeremy Soul's music, but he doesn't really write symphonies, and that's the virtue of it, is that it's not a symphony. It's impressionistic. It comes in, gives you an impression, a feeling, a melody, maybe references some other melody, and then it kind of fades out. It's perfect for what it is.
And maybe that still tells a story. It's still rising and falling and taking you places, but yeah, it's like a different dimension to storytelling, I think.
I love how blatantly Christian David has become over the last few years. It's always apparent, but now it's unavoidable. Well, I mean, you have to come back to the, what's the basis of this stuff. And the other thing too is like, I studied like Roman and Greek religion pretty thoroughly at one point. And it made me more Christian because certainly with my evangelical upbringing, I was not taught a lot of historicity of the church or the historical reality of the religions of other people that weren't in the Bible, right? Like, what did the people of the Levant actually do during this time, and what did religious ceremony look like for people who aren't, members of who aren't Levites, right? So much of the Bible, as far as manuals for worship, and we don't have all of it because it's it's mostly oral again. It's directed towards Israelite priestship and not towards any acknowledgement of other things. That's not the point of it. So I didn't have a lot of that knowledge, and I went and studied it quite a bit, and gaining that perspective really let me understand Christianity a lot better. That there's parallels in lots of other religions. You have portions of what's being represented in the Christian faith as well. You're kind of taught that, well, there's these people and they believed in Zeus, and then we believe in this much more rational being, this Holy Trinity. And Zeus used to be this bad guy and go have affairs and have mortal children. Those myths are not the religion of the ancient people. The ancient people had rituals and beliefs that were much deeper than that kind of stuff. Those were just tales. And kind of trying to think of them outside the context of the way that they practice their religion would be like reading a random prophet from the Old Testament outside of the context of the church. Like, it just wouldn't really make a lot of sense. You wouldn't quite know what the story is about. Like, if you read, Job would be a good one, but probably my favorite would be Jonah. Jonah just doesn't really make a lot of sense outside of the religious tradition. You're like, why is he being swallowed by a fish? Why is he in the fish for 3 days? What does that mean, right? Why doesn't he want to go tell these other people up in where was he going? Up in Assyria somewhere.
Yeah, in Iraq.
Yeah. Why is he not wanting to go tell these people about God? He hates them because they're the enemies of Israel, and God's telling him to do something for people, to save people he hates, and he gets upset that they get saved. There's like a whole story there that doesn't make any sense unless you know all the context. So once you know the context of Greek and Roman religion, it's so fascinating. Like, it's really fun to study Roman religion, and I'm sure you've studied it. It's in it. A lot of the stuff's in Matt's books, guys. You gotta get. I already ordered the new one. Even though his fence fell down, I have no doubt he's going to deliver the new book because he's never missed on one of these crowdfunds. So yeah, you gotta check out the books. A lot of the stuff is in here, which is what I love. It's very, it's got the fun bits, like the stuff from King Solomon's Mines or like Indiana Jones or something, but it has a lot of the historical stuff too, which I enjoy. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, it's very H. Rider Howard is a guy that I enjoy a lot. Haggard, sorry, but yeah, like it's fun to kind of there's a peculiar challenge with fiction writing, which is I just find this fun. This is probably one of the other reasons I like historical fiction is because you can say, like, okay, I'm framing this fictional story in a way that feels a bit like it like the Aeneid. Like, there's a North African shipwreck. Mm-hmm. And is this female character, is she actually going to be a leader in this situation that's actually going to help bring these Roman characters back to some kind of salvation point? That's very much like an Aeneas type situation. So I can actually pepper that stuff in a way mm-hmm. where if you know the Aeneid, you're going to enjoy that. If not, it's just kind of seasoning that culturally. I don't know. I like to think it would be a distraction to people who have no idea what but it's secondary to the narrative of the actual characters.
Yeah.
But it just kind of helps provide that flavoring, which is fun. That would be a little harder to do in just a pure fantasy setting. Maybe that's just my inexperience as a fantasy author. I wouldn't know.
I mean, you could certainly do it. Like I said, in my book, I say it's when I say classic tragedy, I mean it's even in 5 acts, the way Shakespeare would write a play in 5 acts, and those 5 acts take the same 5-act formula. And I use this in Muramasa, by the way. There's a Shakespearean 5-act formula, where you have an exposition, and then you have a conflict, a secondary conflict that builds, and you have a big middle point where everything's being reshuffled, and then the last 2 acts drive you home to the tragic conclusion of what's going on. So that's the way a 5-act structure works, and this one sticks to that pretty strictly. So if you read Shakespeare, well, you're going to definitely get the format of what's going on here. And if you are into classical Greek tragedy, you're going to find a lot of those things. So it's in the ancient dramatic tradition. It's interesting, speaking of writing, the oldest fiction traditions we have are really dramatic traditions. You spoke the words, you acted out the story. You didn't merely read it off of, people didn't have access to scrolls to just read very often. You know, we're very decadent in that we can all be scholars and read books and enjoy the written word. But back in the day, if you wanted to transmit a story, you had to act it out. So someone would write it down, but then people had to say the lines. People had to say the words. So anyway, it's all there, right? It's very ancient stuff that you get to pick up on. You can do that in fantasy too. You can have a shipwreck. You can have something that's very referential of the Odyssey or something like that. The Hobbit is its plot format is an Odyssey plot format. That is a kind of plot structure called an Odyssey. At least I call it the Odyssey, because the Odyssey is really our earliest example of what that is. And rather than being, this 5-act thing where it's highly formalized about where conflict happens, it's really a series of adventures. It's a series of episodes that each one is exposing something particular about the time, place, culture, the characters, their faults, the lessons, those sorts of things. That's really where the Odyssey is. Each island that Odysseus goes to, he experiences something different that exposes thought and really message about the life of Athenians in that time, their religious views, their cultural views. The Odyssey is such a rich, and the Aeneid as well, but the Iliad. These are such rich things if you are able to dig into the context of what's going on. Otherwise, you're just kind of reading a weird story, like why I think Hermes comes to him at one point when he's climbing up. He's like, eat this plant and it'll stop you from turning into the pig. It's like, what does this have to do? When I first read it, I just thought it was weird, but I remember taking a class with Bruce Thornton, a classicist in Central California.
Oh, nice.
Huh? Mm-hmm. You know Bruce?
Yeah, that's great. I've caught his online lectures.
Okay, yeah. So Bruce, I know Bruce. I played at his son's wedding, and
wow.
I'm friends with his kids. I used to play gigs with his son. His son used to play in a punk rock band, and we play gigs together and stuff. So anyway, I know Bruce. He's a great guy, and he pointed out, he's like, this entire story, the big theme is about when is it not okay to eat, because in the ancient world and in Greek culture in particular, eating is really important. Food is much more scarce then, but how and when you eat and how the eating is ritualized is really important to this culture. So the consequence that they all turned into pigs because they ate out of order. They did not eat when it was appropriate to eat. And you have the same thing with like Polyphemus, the Cyclops, that they are basically doing things wrong. They're doing things in the wrong way. They're not, the Romans called it mos maiorum, like the way of the ancients. They aren't doing it in the traditional way, and then they suffer big consequences. The gods get very angry because they do things wrong. And then in some cases, God intervenes and says, you can do this. I'm telling you to eat this now. So it's sacred and proper for you to eat it. And this will prevent you from having the downfall of the other sailors who turned into pigs from eating the food when they were hungry, when they weren't supposed to. So like there's deep stuff in the Odyssey if you know the context. But a lot of times we just, like in the modern world, you could watch a movie adaptation of the Odyssey, and none of that stuff's going to be apparent to you because you're missing what the Greeks thought about that kind of thing. So it's worth your time anytime you want to read a classic to do a little bit of historical research and kind of think about what the culture really thought about that stuff. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Oh yeah, it just reminds me of what you said about metal and jazz. That in a way, like the artists who are, when they're innovating, those are the things that through the ages that we take for granted in a way, and then the stuff that they're not that they themselves in their own context, their immediate audience context, are not innovating on, that they're just assuming that you're already going to pick up on. Those are the things that we have to sometimes take extra steps to recontextualize ourselves, to kind of reformulate where they're coming from, because they didn't have to explain that, so they don't, either musically or orally, they don't have to communicate certain things to immediate audience, but then later on we have to kind of reconstruct that to an extent. Which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's true with, it's true with music, it's true with literature as well. There's a thing with music where, people will go to a concert and they'll listen to, I was listening to one on YouTube the other day. They'll perform a mass by Jacobus Obrecht or Jacob Obrecht. Now that's great. It's beautiful music and these are expert singers. How should you listen to a mass written by Jacob Obrecht? You should listen to it in a Trinity Mass. I mean, it should be a Mass. He wrote it to be part of a religious ceremony. So abstracted from that religious ceremony, it loses a portion of its beauty. If you don't have the priest doing the chants in between these pieces, you're losing what the Mass is about. You're losing why he composed it to begin with. And it's the same thing with Bach masses or anything. Like, so much of our music was religious in the West. I mean, everywhere. So much of the music was religious, but particularly in the West, our written tradition for music, it's almost exclusively religious up until, other than some English. England was the only group that really was writing down a lot of secular music in the Middle Ages, but or lute music. You have lute tablature, or you have religious music. That's what you have. So, so much of it's religious, and yet we perform it completely outside of its context. You go see a concert band, they play a Bach chorale. Great, Bach wrote beautiful chorales. How were they intended to be played? Well, he wrote music for church. They were part of church services. So that's really, having them outside that context, we're going to lose what it's about. And I think that's really true of like Renaissance music or Middle Ages music that is the Mass. It is a Mass. It's the music for Mass. How should we do it? Well, we should respectfully attend a Mass that's performing this and experience the religious experience that it was intended to be. Like, can you imagine how beautiful these professional singers in the Renaissance were amazing? Could you imagine going to your local church and having your Mass be so profoundly beautiful when you haven't heard any good music all week because you don't have a Walkman? It would be transcendental. Like, it would be just amazing. It's hard to put it into words how effective something like that would be for the people at the time.
Yeah, and nowadays, if you go like the only equivalent I can think for most people, or for me in most contexts, is I guess during Christmas time, a lot of churches open up and they do like your secular Christmas classics to like a live jazz band or something.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's kind of like almost, I don't know, like ascribing to pop music some kind of ritual significance just because it's, I don't know. That's kind of sad when you have there's a desert, I guess, of live ritual performance.
Yeah, and it's very much. Yeah, it's very much alive in some traditions. And believe it or not, like Protestant churches really emphasize live music a lot, and as much as I don't really like worship music, and I am not a Protestant really, so I was raised as one, that's where most live music happens. And if you open up a Sweetwater catalog or something, the biggest market for all the live equipment, this is who you'll see it in every kind of sales write-up. You're going to mention worship bands, because that's who buys the live sound equipment. It's churches. Churches are the ones buying the equipment. Individual dudes like I have a PA. I haven't used it in years because I haven't been gigging, but I can make an album in my living room. Great. I don't need like a highly complex wireless setup to put on a show because I'm not doing shows. And if I was, I'm not doing one at the Lakewood Church venue here in Houston, which has like 5,000 people 3 times on Sunday or something. So yeah, that's where the market is. So they have a tradition of live music. All churches do, but Protestants in particular like really have a performance every week. But thinking about that too, a lot of times for Christmas, people think of Christmas music, and you go to the store and it's piping in, and you're familiar with all these Christmas music. Very few people think of like the vigil like the Christmas Eve vigil, where you go and there's like a 4-hour liturgy where you stand and pray, awaiting midnight, which is the vigil for Christ's birth. You're reenacting the angels waiting for Christ to be born. It's very symbolic and has a deeper meaning. Most people will never experience that, and they think of Christmas on these kind of surface levels of like, you go shopping and you buy presents for people, and here's the music, and I like the aesthetics, and I like the music, and I like the cold, and I love decorating for Christmas, and all those things are great. There's nothing wrong with liking any of those, but it's not quite the same as where it comes from, where you're having, an actual vigil for the birth of Christ.
Yeah, a Christ mass.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The cats are meowing again. I can't hear anything right now, but yeah, I have one cat who will he's old and he's gone kind of deaf. So if he can't see anybody, he'll just start meowing really loud. And he doesn't know how loud he is. He just starts meowing like, "Where's everyone? Hello?" And so you come over and you pick him up and he's like, "Oh, there you are."
I've got a female cat that does that too.
Yeah. He's kind of old and a little senile. It's okay.
Yeah.
All right, take it easy, Kyle. Thanks for dropping by. Professional.
Your chat is always just incredible. Like, it's always a higher level.
Yeah, I need to read it more. But I get so involved in ranting and talking to you. Anyway, where was I? People talk about EFAP. I was making a joke that it's a masturbation podcast, and then they finally it takes a couple times. People are like, "Oh, I get what you mean." Talking for 7 hours about a Marvel movie is a masturbatory exercise. I'm like, I'd rather use that 7 hours to make art. That's me.
Yeah, absolutely.
But honestly, like if that's the content you like, that's fine. Enjoy that. Enjoy that oral teaching. That is probably not for me, but that's okay. It's your right to consume whatever stuff you think is interesting, and it's my right to make fun of it a little bit too. So much of the way we experience media nowadays is all about decontextualization, not just purposeful subversion of things, but poor delivery of the works. Now, what a good statement that is. That it's this is the big thing that I complain about with most modern media. It's actually not. It's not the subversion. It's not the politicizing of it. That's often very, very minor. It's that it's just poorly executed. And in most cases, the worst part of any modern production is the writing, which is paradoxically the cheapest part. Writers are the lowest paid people in the production. And so as a result, I mean, maybe it's not paradoxical. They're just not willing to spend on good writing because they don't view it as valuable at all, I guess. But yeah, the writing is the problem. The writers don't know what they're writing. They can't even write dialogue that sounds like a human being would say it. Maybe they don't talk to people. I don't know what it is. Maybe we're losing our ability to converse with human beings. Maybe we were all becoming autistic. I don't know. But the dialogue is so bad in most modern productions, it's almost like you just cringe. You cringe inwardly when you hear it.
I know some people talk about the dialogues being written to be able to be easily translated across every major market on the planet.
Oh, that's a good point.
What flattens it. Yeah.
I know that. See, because I've worked in the Hollywood machine, I guess, a little bit in writing scripts. I kind of know how it works. Like it almost never works the way that a normal writer or person outside of it would think, where you write a movie and then they shoot the movie. It does not happen that way. What happens is you write a movie that's basically a speculative script. You write the movie. It gets optioned, so they pay you a little bit of money so that you don't sell it to someone else, and they have an option of buying it at some full price, which they determine later. Maybe you hear a big number like $35,000, and you're like, man, I made it big. It's like, that might be the only script you ever sell. Most writers in Hollywood never... The only writers I knew in Hollywood that actually had work, I knew guys who like wrote for Spike Lee. They had a day job. Every one of them had a day job. They were like helicopter pilots and stuff. They had high-paying day jobs because the writing, you couldn't pay the bills on it. The only people who were in writers' rooms were like 25-year-old kids, like straight out of graduate school, who are terrible writers, honestly, because college doesn't make you a good writer. It just doesn't. We have plenty of evidence of that. It's just, you will know them by their fruits. most college graduates are bad writers. Sorry. Anyway. Once they have that script, they send it to a script doctor who will rewrite it, and then another one who will rewrite it. It gets rewritten 10 to 20 times, sometimes upwards of 30, before it even gets to production. And while it's being produced, the director, of course, will be like, I don't like this scene. I'm going to rewrite it. I'm going to have my friend rewrite it. It gets rewritten half a dozen times while it's being shot. And so the end result may be something that is just completely different from what you wrote. Best example, if you want to look into it, and I mean, I would almost want to write a book on this, like call up the writers, and is The Last Action Hero by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it was originally a parody script, and it got picked up and then rewritten a bunch of times and rewritten again because each person in each step didn't like something fundamental about the script before you get to the final product, which is just completely schizophrenic with what it is. This happens with a lot of movies. Everything gets kind of flattened out, or it just becomes a jumble of ideas because there's too many cooks in that pot, too many people in each step of the way demanding rewrites and things that change. You know, a script that I wrote with my brother-in-law, the feedback we got is like, you have to change all these things, and we're like, we were imagining a movie that was more like Super Troopers. We wrote this comedy, and it's like, no, it needs to be a movie like this. It's like, it's not the movie we wrote. After like 4 rewrites, we're like, we don't recognize this, and I don't like it. I didn't want to write this movie, you know? So you get to a point with those sorts of things where you know, it becomes so different from the original concept of the product that it's no longer an artistic expression of what you're doing. Yeah, so poor delivery is part of it. I think that's part of it as well. They just don't, you know, I don't know, imagine somebody, I don't know, I'm trying to imagine like an example of this. I can't think of a good one, but it would be like if somebody were to make Animal Farm and they're an avowed communist. Like, it'd be rather difficult. Like, it's just a story about animals, right? So they just write this story about animals kicking out the farmer, and you make an avowed communist gets a hold of it, and he writes it just as a movie about animals kicking out the farmer. And he's like, I don't like that. Nobody's going to like these pig characters. Let's just cut them out. You know, so you just lose the entire sense of what the story's about because you just have it. You don't realize it's allegory, I guess.
Yeah. Why did he write? You know, why did he have some characters say some animals are more equal than others? Like what? Like that doesn't even make sense.
That doesn't make sense. Cut it.
Yeah.
You know, not realizing it's about communism at all. Like just you know, and I you made jokes about this on Twitter. It's like we found another Neolithic artifact. It probably has some religious significance.
Yeah.
This happens so much. And Bruce Thornton actually talks about this in a book called Plagues of the Mind, a New Epidemic of False Knowledge, which has a couple of examples. And one of them, you know, he talks about the white man's golden age red man, which is this myth that the American Indian was this perfect being who lived in harmony with nature, which is just a bizarre, dehumanizing way to view the culture of Native Americans, the many cultures that they had. But Europeans contextualize it in that way because they encountered them a lot, and they read James Fenimore Cooper during the Romantic period when Europeans weren't dealing with natives really, so they just had this idea like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we just lived in the forest like forest people? It's like, the American Indians didn't do that. They didn't live the way that you imagine, like in perfect harmony with nature. What are you talking about? Existence is hard. You got to scrape it out of the earth with your brute strength and your knowledge. Like, it's not an easy life simply because you happen to live in a tent instead of a house. Like, what? Wouldn't life be so much better if we just lived in tents? No, we made houses for good reasons.
Yeah. Interestingly, I feel like that goes all the way back to our Roman roots in a way, where they would kind of first conquer and then romanticize the conquered.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
and Romans themselves would kind of debate about the moral consequences of doing that.
And Romans were big into syncretism as well, which is like they'd see the foreign religion and then they would compare it to their own and declare it. They worship the same gods as us, and they were really kind of respectful of other religions and took them very seriously because of how much they took their own religion seriously. The Roman mindset is kind of foreign to us, but once you kind of get a grasp of it, I think it explains a lot of the way Romans dealt with their empire, why their empire persisted for so long. How long? 2,000 years. If you start with early Italian Empire and you continue it through the fall of Constantinople, it's about probably over 2,000 years. But like the beginnings are so, this king ruled for 60 years. Like, probably not, but okay. Anyway, this Plagues of the Mind book had this thing on these. Remember these Venus statues? These pop up every once in a while. People started making up a cult about these Venus statues. They started believing that ancient Europeans believed in this mother goddess, and they worshipped Mother Nature, and it was the evil Iron Age that came and obliterated it and replaced this beautiful Gaia goddess with these martial gods like Mars and Zeus and Odin, right? These evil martial gods, these male martial gods about war, right? And it's true, like the gods are very martial in European mythology. All of them are, not just Mars, but Jupiter has there's martial rituals having to do with Jupiter, Odin, and Tyr, and all of them.
Indo-European.
It's part of being European. Anyway, so it's like you've constructed a cult out of an imagination over an artifact you found in the dirt from 5,000 or 10,000 years ago or whatever. We don't know what that was. We know that somebody put it in the dirt. Somebody carved it with hands, and it's a female figure because she has breasts and a pregnant belly and a butt, I guess. And then someone threw it in the dirt for you to find it. That's all we really know about it. It may have been a good luck charm. It might have been religious. It might have not referenced anything. So this is a Venus. They even call it a Venus statue. It's like, we don't know that that's like anything religious necessarily, or that it is representative of a divinity. And if it's a representative of divinity, you're automatically jumping into kind of a syncretist mindset of saying, well, it's Venus and all fertility goddesses are Venus. When in the pagan mindset, you may not have even had the same Jupiter, right? Like, it's like, which, you worship Zeus. Which Zeus? Which Jupiter you were? Are you Jupiter Optimus Maximus is the Jupiter that's over in the temple. But I have my Jupiter in my house. Are they the same Jupiter? Maybe, maybe not. The pagans had a lot more subtle view of who the gods were, and you might have multiple Zeuses, and you might have multiple Tyrs, right? Like Tyr to this tribe is different from that tribe, and it all was very complex because each person had their own religion. There was no pagan religion. Everybody was their own. Their family had a religion. There was a secret family religion in ancient Greece, and one of your duties as a male child was to continue the family religion. And when you married a woman, she came and she lived in your house, and she couldn't leave it because she was part of your family religion now, not that other family religion. And you may have secret household gods that weren't part of any of these myths. You may tell stories about them, but they aren't written down. Like, it's just, there's so much there. I encourage people to really find a good book on it and study it. I'll give a recommendation on a lecture series I listened to. Not to just dominate the conversation. While I find that, I don't know if you have anything to say about it.
No, please recommend. Like, this is my favorite. What I planned to do was get you talking, because I think that's what I'm most interested in when you're talking, and I think the chat is too. I just came with questions. I think this is really fascinating.
It's called The Pagan World. So it's here it is. So you can get it on Audible. It's basically a whole course by Hans Friedrich Müller, who's written some books and stuff on this. Goes into all of the things that I mentioned about, quote, what paganism is. There's no religion called paganism. Rather, kind of like Hinduism, it's a classification we have for a multitude of religious traditions that are in the same geographic location and for similar peoples. So, various Italian tribes outside of Rome, of course, had their own gods, a lot of the Roman pantheon was gods literally stolen from their neighbors. They'd go over there and fight a war with them. And there was one where, I'm trying to remember what war it was. Anyway, there was Venus. They had the statue of Venus. They invited Venus to come live with them at Rome. She showed them favor by giving them victory over their enemies, over their opponents. Then they carted the statue back to Rome and placed her in the Roman temple, and she became the Roman fertility goddess. That's how Venus got to Rome. Like, it's weird to think about. Now, the people may have had fertility goddesses. They may have had Venus as a fertility goddess, but not that Venus. That Venus came from this Italian city that they conquered. And they conquered it because Venus liked them so much she wanted to go to Rome and no longer live in the Italian city. Like, this mindset is very different from our modern mindset. But it will draw you closer to Christianity as well, because you'll understand a lot of the rituals of Christianity, particularly if you're like me and you have an evangelical background where all of the traditions have been kind of divorced. They've been decontextualized, as who said that? Professional Consumer said. They've been decontextualized from what they mean. Like, you go to an evangelical church and they'll have like the Lord's Supper. So they'll have some bread and some grape juice for like communion, but they don't believe it does anything. So you have to wonder, like, why are we doing this? Well, Jesus said to do it. He said, do this in remembrance of me. So we got to do it every once in a while. I think we should do it. But what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to take, what does it do to me? Right? In the Orthodox tradition, it's the remission of sins. Wait, do I have to eat this to be forgiven? No, it's for remission of sin, meaning it will make you more godlike. You're like, what? This is what are these people? It's like, this is ancient tradition, but the rituals have a completely different significance if you know of them in their context. When you say Jesus the same way, there's many different Jesuses depending on the Christian you ask and their denomination. This is a really, really good point, because there are many denominations, and many of them have different concepts of who Jesus was or what he did. And there was many heterodox views, even going back to the early churches, to who Christ was. And in this case, it's different from the pagan view, because the pagan view, we're not trying to determine who the true Zeus is. Both of them can be Zeus and be different from each other and both be Zeus, or be different Zeuses or the same Zeus. This is, Christian denominations are they have a different view of, it's not just like, if I'm Mormon, I have a Christ, and you're Catholic and you have a Christ, and you're Orthodox and you have a Christ, and you're evangelical. No, they're different beliefs about one person who's supposed to be the same person. So it's different in that way. I wonder what the Hindus think about Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, with their precious Kali being portrayed as a human sacrifice goddess by the Thuggee cult.
I think it wasn't allowed to be
shown in India.
I think the Indian government didn't show it in India.
Boy.
Yeah. I don't even think they could film it. I think they filmed it in Sri Lanka as a result. So there's that.
Yeah. Well, Hinduism is a really good example. There's no Hindu religion.
Yeah.
Now, this is not from me. This is from other people who are Hindus. Right. Hindu is a syncretist and universalist term for the folk religions of India and the different views that are in them. You can talk to one Hindu in one part of Italy, and he'll have a cosmology that's very different from a Hindu in a different part of India. And they worship different manifestations of God, different gods, different deities. They have different rituals and practices, and even different cosmologies about how the world exists or how it doesn't exist and things like that. People, I've known Sikhs that were very upset that Gandhi called all Indians Hindus, but what he really meant by that is that the religions of India are universally, like, it's a kind of an appeal to, I don't want to use the word Catholic improperly here, but a Catholic view of India, the Indian people and their religions as being all unified, even the Sikhs, which have a very different cosmology and religion than most Hindus. So it depends which Hindu you talk to about the Temple of Doom. There might be some that don't even care about Kali. They have no idea who that is. They don't give a crap. They're like, I don't know, that's something people in South India worship. I don't care about that. You don't quite know. It depends who you're talking to. Or they're like, that's not a proper representation. Or there's people who are like, that's anathema. It probably depends on who you talk to. Really, really interesting thing. I'm not a Hindu expert, but that's something that I've discovered, I guess more recently, is that there's no Hinduism as a religion. There's no church of Hinduism. It's an assortment of traditional religions that are local and have been born up through the ages in India, with many writings associated with them, lots of things like that.
Yeah, it's a British category for exonym. Is that the term?
Exonym?
Outsider term.
Yes, an exonym. That's a good one. But there's another thing. A musicologist, an ethnomusicologist that I studied with. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name, and I feel so bad about it. But he said something to me once, which is that authenticity is made, not found. This is an important anthropological idea when it comes to arts. Authenticity is made, not found. So within a culture, there's no such thing as authentic art. That concept is completely foreign. If you're in your culture and you're making art, it's simply the art of your culture. It's simply art. You're just doing art. You're not thinking about how do I make my art authentic to my culture. You're just doing what you do. It's only when that becomes exported as a cultural product. A great example would be flamenco, right? Flamenco is a music that's, what's the word, endemic to southern Spain primarily, and North Africa, but mostly southern Spain, Andalusia. It's played by a variety of people, and it's been played by a variety of people for hundreds of years, maybe longer, but it's a traditional art form that developed out of that. I played flamenco, I guess, professionally or semi-professionally for years ago. So I studied with Juan Serrano, who was a master from Spain.
Wow.
What makes authentic flamenco only became a question in the 20th century when you had people like Juan Serrano or Paco de Lucia going out and playing their music for other people, and other people hearing that music and making decisions about what that music meant and trying to classify it as flamenco. Flamenco was just flamenco, and so now you have, this is inauthentic flamenco because it's played by someone who's not from Spain. Even if I am part of the oral teaching tradition of Spain because I studied with Spanish masters, because I'm not born of Spain, I'm not a flamenco player. And you actually ended up with this very, very racist view of flamenco to not only be Spanish, but to be specifically Gitano, specifically Gypsy, Roma. Right? Now, this is nonsense. Yeah. This is complete nonsense, the idea that flamenco is a art of the Roma people or an art of gypsies, of the Gitanos. That would be, most of the people I've known who played flamenco are not gypsies, including the Spaniards. They're just Spanish. They're not, they don't live in some cave. It became an encapsulation of this, was like, this is part of these special people from this special place called gypsies. It's like, no. It's actually, this comes from my teacher one. It's Mozarabic. The Mozarabs were not gypsies. The Mozarabs were a group of people that lived in Spain. They were Christians under Muslim dominion back during when the Muslims had conquered southern Spain. They weren't gypsies. They were just an ethnic group that existed, right? Only later, when you have gypsies going around, do foreigners come in and think, oh well, it's this gypsy music. I'm going to go to gypsy huerga and like hang out with gypsies and listen to gypsy music. It's like, you've made a form of authenticity. You've created what authentic means when none of that existed in the home culture at all. It's like it's not. I'm not going to say it's forged, but it's an invented context because people in the culture don't need context. They simply live in the culture.
Yeah. So it's outsider imposed and in groups and out groups are needed to be invented and shaped and defined, I guess.
Yeah.
In order to create that authenticity.
Yeah, Kai says, in my experience, Hinduism is not a religion, but a culture, a way of life. Now, this describes many Eastern religious traditions. And the thing is, like, most of us in the West, even if you're Protestant, in a sense, you're Catholic because you're coming from a schism of the Catholic Church. But in the Eastern view, religion is a way of life. It's not simply something you do on Sunday. It's not a set of theological traditions, even though that's part of it, right? Theology is really for the deep seekers, and many Indians will say this as well. Like, yoga is not, there's different levels of yoga. There's yoga for people who are deep seekers, but that's not most people. Most people need a different religion that just allows them to live their life in a happy and fulfilling way and directs them correctly. They don't need to understand the nature of atoms and the nature of the universe and the nature of God. They need to know how to live. So in the Orthodox tradition, in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's a way of life. They call it the phronema, which means a mindset. There's a way of thinking about life. You don't show up to church. This is so different from evangelical tradition, and even today, I think. I'm not going to say anything about the Catholic Church because that would have been incorrect. But in the especially Baptist tradition, 4 bare walls in a sermon, it's really common to go to a service and you'll have some music, some like high quality music, and then you'll have a 45-minute to an hour-long sermon by a preacher. The preacher will preach for an hour. You compare this to an Orthodox liturgy or traditional Catholic liturgy, say Trinitine Mass, where you go and it is music and chanting and prayer nonstop until you get to readings of an epistle and a gospel maybe, and then you might have a homily for 10-15 minutes. Then you have communion and all the music that goes with it. It is a practice of the religion. The homily is the instruction part. It's a fraction, and the rest of it's just practice. And you're raised in the church and you live out the practice of the church. You live the way the church is supposed to direct you to live. You think about their typical medieval peasant. If we think about like the Catholic Church in the medieval period or any Christian, prior to 1000, right? They couldn't read probably. They couldn't write. Were they going to heaven because they didn't have deep theological knowledge of the cosmos passed down by St. Augustine or St. Gregory or whoever else? No, because they lived their life authentically. They knew we go to church, we worship God, we try to fix the sin that's within ourselves, we pray and move closer to God. This is why the rosary is such a powerful instrument. The rosary really became popular in the medieval period, and it was a way for people who couldn't memorize psalms to engage in ritual prayer that was easy to do. You want to reduce the barriers between the practitioner and prayer. So you have that rosary, boom, you only have to memorize like 2 or 3 prayers and you can pray the rosary. Boom, it's so easy. Versus having to memorize long psalms when you can't read them and you don't have a copy of the book at hand. Praying psalms was, and having a psalter, they used to sell, they still sell them actually. So a psalter would just be the book of Psalms, and you can open it up and pray a psalm and meditate on what that psalm means and make it your prayer. Same thing with the rosary. You make that your prayer, and you got to only know a couple of prayers in order to execute the rosary and commune with God. It's a great instrument. So yeah, your typical medieval peasant was probably more likely to go to heaven than your modern theologian, simply because he lived the life more fully than your modern academic sitting there thinking about writing a long treatise on whether salvation by faith alone is true or not. The medieval guy just lived it. Are you going to say he didn't go to heaven because he didn't know the ins and outs of theosis or something? No, knowledge doesn't save you, but living the life and growing closer to God does. So sorry, that's my long rant. Gypsy is also an exonym. Oh, that's a good point. Sorry, Richard, do this. Gypsy is also an exonym. That's not what they call themselves. That's a good point. was I? Oh, yeah, 330 million gods. Those might overlap. They might be the same or different views of the same gods, different approaches to explaining how God works, different manifestations of gods. Yeah. So you hear that too with, like, the Romans had these thousands of gods. It's like, yeah, but some of those overlapped. You know, not all of them were prayed to all the time. It's not like you had a list of 2,000 gods you had to do rituals for. There was a god of the door hinges. You really only would try to please him when you built a house because you had to put door hinges in. There was a god at the door. You know, when you're building a doorway in Rome, you'd have, and there's a doorway next to me. You guys can kind of see it, right? So you'd have the god of the door frame and the god of the doorway, Janus. And then you'd have, I don't remember the god of the door hinges, but there's a god of door hinges. There's a god of locks and doorknobs. There's a god of the threshold. Actually, the god of threshold, I think, is Janus. But there's a god of the floor. There's a god of the foundations. And you would do rituals to all of them when you built the house because you wanted to please the gods. So it's easy, if you're outside of it, to think, oh, man, it must be so confusing to be a Roman and have all these gods. It's like, not really. Just in the same way that there's like a multitude of saints or things like that. The typical Roman was not thinking about Cloaca, the god of the sewers, when he was pooping. He didn't have a ritual to Cloaca. It's just they only really thought about Cloaca when they were building sewers. That's it. You know, it's not quite as complicated as it seems from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ganesh is almost god of the threshold. Yeah, you'd have different gods for different roles. You want to please them in different ways. Roman religious life was about maintaining what's called the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. There's a very strong belief in that if you didn't perform the rituals, you could bring ruin on Rome. So this is why Christians were so persecuted in the first centuries, is they didn't want to perform any of the rituals. The Romans didn't care whether you believed or not, because they didn't believe in gods who could like read your mind and care about your piousness. Your piousness was what you did, not what you thought. So Julius Caesar, when he says he's pious and has the favor of the gods, we don't really know if he believed that, but he certainly performed the rituals in a pious way.
Yeah.
So,
and doing the opposite of that would make you an atheist, right?
Yes.
These were the first atheists.
Yes, exactly. They considered them superstitious and atheists, and atheism was a crime against the state. It was a crime against the state, punishable by death. We have to perform these sacrifices to Jupiter, because the only reason Rome exists is because Jupiter loves us. And if Jupiter stops loving us, we could be destroyed, we could be conquered. You have to come participate in the state religion, because we have to have Jupiter on our side. We have to have peace with Jupiter. And if you don't perform it, he's going to get mad. He's going to be like, why isn't insert Roman name here? Why isn't Septimus performing part of this? Why isn't he participating in the rituals for me, Jupiter? Well, perhaps I'll send a lightning storm to strike all of you, to teach you the error of your ways in not performing my rituals. Okay? And you only exist because I choose to let you exist. I am Jupiter. Optimus Maximus. Right? So they believed this stuff, and it was really important. They took it very seriously. Consequently, I think that's also why they were perfect pre-Christians, is that in comes a religion that has a cosmology that they can grasp and understand the importance of.
Yeah.
Versus the people out in the sticks just didn't have probably the same mindset as the Roman society. And you know what? As Christians, we're prohibited from performing auspices. A lot of people today don't know what auspices even are. Matt knows probably what auspices are, but like you would, you do a sacrifice to a god, and then you go look for omens to tell you what to do. This is prohibited for most Christians. I'm just gonna say most. There might be some denomination out there that believes in auspices, but most of you're not going to be doing. Most of you would either consider it superstitious mumbo jumbo, but I would like to give you a little bit different perspective on auspices, which is that they may have worked, and there's historical documentation that they worked. I'm trying to remember the general. I forget the names. But here's what they would do. The Roman army carried around chickens. You guys want to know about the Roman chickens? All right. So the Roman army would carry around these chickens, and before a battle, they had a guy. I'm trying to remember what he had an official title. I don't remember the Latin word for it, but basically he was the chicken feeder. He was the keeper of the chickens, and he was a priest. So the priest would keep the chickens. He was a kind of priest. You'd let the chickens out prior to a battle, and you'd feed them. And if the chickens fed greedily, that meant the gods probably favored you. But if the chickens were not interested in your grain, that meant the gods may not favor you today, and you should have caution. And there was an example where the priest was feeding the chickens. I'm trying to remember what general it was. I want to say some 2nd century general. And the chickens wouldn't eat the corn, or the chickens wouldn't eat the grain. And the general got so mad, he grabbed the chickens and he threw them in the Mediterranean. He threw them in the sea and killed them. And he lost the battle. Right? He got completely destroyed and he got killed in battle. So the auspices might be correct. The same thing about necromancy. You're not to do necromancy as a Christian, but it's in the Bible. King Saul goes to a medium and calls forth the spirit of Saul from Sheol. Saul calls forth the spirit of Samuel. And Samuel is not happy about a medium drawing his spirit from the afterlife. What are you doing? Why are you disturbing me? And Saul is terrified, and the medium is scared to death because it worked, right? She's scared to death because Saul has appeared and Samuel has appeared and chastised Saul. And a lot of scholars will say that's the moment when Saul really lost the favor of God because he performed an abominable act. He did not trust God. He went around God and tried to go to a medium. And not only that, but he pulled forth Samuel the prophet, like one of God's chosen men, and it was a terrible thing to do. So I submit to you that there are beings, auspices may have worked, but why are you not allowed to do them? It's because you need to have your faith in God, not in some sort of other pagan entity whom you're trying to ask their favor for. God's will always prevails, and so you have to fully trust that. So if you understand that, then the whole trusting in God and not doing auspices thing and not doing mediums thing, this makes sense because the ancient people did these things, took them seriously, and they may have worked. I think in some myths, Rome actually began as an argument over auspices. That Romulus and Remus went out, they performed a sacrifice, and they went out, and they saw... they went looking for birds. So this is looking for auspices. Usually you look for birds. And so I'm trying to remember what it was. Romulus saw the birds first, but Remus saw birds on the other side that were bigger. So who should be the one to determine where Rome should be built? Should it be Romulus who saw the birds first, or should it be Remus who saw the biggest birds? So then they fought to the death, and Romulus prevailed. And thus Rome was founded. As a weird myth, right? Which was the correct way to determine the auspices in this circumstance? Well, there's probably some ritual significance we've lost along the way about that myth, where certain kinds of auspices are more favored than others, depending on the circumstances, and we just don't understand those. That the proper auspices, proper auspice is the first birds because you were asking for the first sign, and bigger birds is you trying to subvert the will of the gods. But we don't have all that information now.
Yeah. I try to play a little bit with Romulus and Remus in the Curie books. With I think this is relatively. I like to think this is pretty authentic because I feel like Tacitus and others kind of play with this too. But the idea that this is a city born in fratricide, right? This is a city that and it is born in an idea in a way, in combat, and it's forged out of outsiders. It's
all these bandits are the first people to form it. Mm-hmm. They have no women, so how do they get the women? Rape of the Sabines. Which brings me back. So one of the main female character's name is Savinella in this book, aka
nice.
Savina, or the Sabine woman, right? So her name is a direct reference to this myth, the rape of the Sabines. Rome is really forged out of rape and violence. It's such a bizarre thing, but they hold those myths, and they hold them so important. To a Roman,
yeah,
go
in
ahead.
a way, it's kind of admirable that they could define themselves in ways that they themselves understood was morally complex at best, and that it kind of in a way it's kind of it's a mythical mirror into their how they dialogued about themselves in relation to others, and like I don't know, I find it kind of interesting. I think I heard a classicist once say, the Greeks invented all these different genres of literature. The only literature genre that the Romans created was satire, which is interesting because they're like there's this kind of like a strictly speaking like a cynical kind of utilitarian approach where I don't know, even in their founding they're kind of like, well, I don't know what we are. I don't know if I really like what we are, but we're gonna forge something, and it's gonna be practical, and it's gonna be built on iron, and
it's the feet of iron, or the legs of iron.
Yeah, it's not gonna be necessarily the prettiest, but it's gonna be the most functional. It's gonna be the strongest.
And this is
there's something we can relate to, I think, with modern culture.
Absolutely, like the Greeks were. Nassim Taleb called it like thinking like a Roman, not like a Greek. So Greeks think in very ideological, ideistic terms, and Romans are like, yeah, we're founded on an ideal, but we do what works. And so if something doesn't work, and if something works, they do it. That's the accumulation of gods. Well, why would you have a god of the doorways? Well, presumably is because that was important and that worked. That recognizing and performing rituals for that god that pleased him would allow the doorway to hold up the weight of the house.
Mm-hmm. It's something that I think a lot of modern readers like us can actually. That's something that we can recognize ourselves in. I think, from the modern Western perspective, is that there is something that seems very relatable. We can see our heritage. I think its origins a lot in Roman. In the Roman worldview in mind, that even the Greek worldview is a further step removed from where we are.
Yeah.
Kind of fascinating.
The legs of iron, like in Daniel's vision, that's Rome. It's ugly, and feet of iron and clay. It's like it's ugly, it's mismatched, but it's more powerful than all the others, and it holds everything up. That's Rome. It's just like the iron march of getting it done. Scipio Africanus beat Hannibal by hiring mercenaries. He hired these who was it? Was it the Nubians or whatever? He hired this tribe that had been allied with Carthage. He's like, we'll just pay you more money, you come fight with us. They're like, okay. And that's how he beat Hannibal. Yeah. Is he just convinced half of his allies to abandon him in exchange for money? Why? Scipio was obviously a genius. Well, the genius is knowing that, like, if you can just buy your allies and win, then that's going to work. Just do that. There is a certain genius to that kind of thinking. And thinking of satire, Ovid. So Ovid is one of the main sources we have for a lot of ancient Greek and Roman mythology and their cosmological mythology, like the origin of the world and the first gods. And even it is written with a slightly satirical tone. It's written not in a 100% serious manner. It's not like reading the Bible or something. These are tales that they've been told, and so Ovid is presenting them in a slightly humorous way sometimes. So you notice the world comes into being via sex. Well, Ovid wrote erotic poetry and erotic literature and stuff. So he really emphasizes the sex in an almost satirical and silly way. The night had sex with the day and brought out chaos. And I'm trying to remember all of it. The heavens had sex with the earth and gave birth to the Titans. But of course, the Titans couldn't escape because the heavens had his penis inside the earth. So Kronos cut it off with a sickle and threw it in the ocean, and out popped Aphrodite. But she was also there from the beginning because she is sex, right? So Ovid is so interesting I've never read it in the original Latin. I need to know enough classical Latin to really dig into it, but it's written with a slightly satirical tone because everybody would have known these stories. Ovid was not writing for people who didn't know this stuff. That's something we forget. Like, those stories were known and told, and he was just presenting them in a little bit different fashion. Hi, David, Matt. My mother lost an older brother in a crash, named me after him. Till my mid-late teens would warn my older brother, watch brother like a hawk, today your Uncle George died. Whoa. That's interesting. Slim Jim. If I had a nickel for every time an evangelical told me I was practicing necromancy, I could quit my job. So that's an evangelical belief that prayer for the intercession of saints is necromancy. They also think like icons are idolatrous. A lot of them do, at least. Most evangelicals, by the way, are not this deep in their own theology. They just go to experience church. I just want to point that out. So like a lot of these are not, there's no evangelical church. There's no such thing as the evangelical church. This is a movement that goes across many denominations, all of which have a diversity of beliefs. It's kind of like the Hinduism thing again. There are many churches who ascribe to evangelical worldviews and evangelical practices. Some of them are Anabaptists, most of them are Anabaptists, some of them are not. It's a very wide-ranging movement of people. But generally, it's going to be Anabaptists, Baptists, some kind of variation of that. So they don't believe in iconography, whereas the ancients believed that because the physical is very important, that's why communion does things. It physically is the body of Christ. Then the icon is more than just a picture of Christ. He is almost it's where the heavens and the earth meet is in that church, and the icon of Christ is like a physical, not just a picture of Christ. It's more than a picture of Christ. That a presence of Christ can exist in that icon. And so when you light a candle, you do a pious action. You light a candle. Or you cross yourself in front of the icon, that does something, that is actually something that God recognizes, and that you are basically doing a prayer to God by seeing that icon. It's something
you're orienting yourself in the direction of the icon, right? Sorry, but
yeah.
you're
not
like I didn't understand this until like I had a boss a number of years ago who was Eastern Orthodox, and he would write icons, and I didn't realize. I used to say, "Well, you're painting icons," and it's like, "No, I'm writing them," and that kind of clarified things for me somewhat, right? That it's actually it's a descriptive mechanism. It's a teaching. It's visual writing more than it is. It's not a painting.
Yes. So yeah, icons are intended to tell stories and tell you about that saint or about Christ or whoever is in the icon. Iconography is very deep. You can watch videos by, say, like Jonathan Pageau if you want kind of more deeper dive into iconography. If anybody, I know that there's people who probably watch his stuff. He's Eastern Orthodox. A lot of this stuff will apply to Western statuary as well. It's just a little bit different tradition, or Western glass iconography. When you would make an icon of a saint, you're telling somebody about that saint. That's part of it. So you're writing kind of a story. In a lot of cases, especially icons from the Middle Ages, Western icons more than Eastern, but Eastern ones will have this as well. They have things that represent the saint. So you may have a saint holding an object that tells you kind of who that saint was, because your typical medieval person wouldn't be doing a lot of reading about the saint, and you didn't have a lot of room to write stuff. So you included in the icon the stuff you needed to know about that saint, who he was and how he lived his life. So in the Eastern tradition, you'll notice that you have all of these saints holding a cross. That actually means they were martyred. So that's telling you a story about their life, that they were a martyr. They died. They were executed for Christ's sake, for the sake of the church. And you may notice that, like angels are often holding certain objects to tell you who they were. So somebody who's really familiar with iconography will immediately be able to know who St. Michael the Archangel is, whether it's Western or Eastern. He's got a spear. Why does St. Michael have the spear? St. Michael is the archangel who overthrows Satan. He's the warrior. Michael means who is like God, and that's a question. Who can be like God? But Michael is also like God in that he's the executor of God's will. And then Gabriel will often be holding a different object, an object of peace, like an olive branch or something like that. So you have lots of these little pieces of information. Outsiders are not going to pick up all this. And if you're an outsider, you have to ask a lot of questions. And insiders often don't think of it. They would simply know that that's Michael. And they wouldn't think, oh, there's a spear. That must be Michael. Right? Or, there's a dragon there, that must be St. George. They would just know that it's St. George. Like, all the icons of St. George look like St. George, so you would just know that that's him. And all the icons of St. Michael would look like St. Michael, you just know that that's him. It's kind of weird to think about if you're an outsider, but all of those things would go into an icon. And a lot of, in the Eastern tradition, they're drawn a little bit exaggerated. Like bigger eyes and maybe bigger ears and a small mouth. And all those things have meaning to them as well. You notice that like Peter and Paul are often presented with each other because they were the apostles who founded the Church of Rome. And so why is Rome important? Well, there were two apostles involved with Rome. It's a di-apostolic tradition in Rome versus the other places it's a single apostle. So you see those representations. Peter and Paul are often together. There's many Peter and Paul churches. You see in stained glass windows, you may have, you're going to know who. How do you know who St. Patrick is? If you see an icon, how do you know it's St. Patrick? It's really easy. He's holding a shamrock.
Oh, yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
He's holding a shamrock or a harp, which is a symbol of Ireland.
It's almost like a meme language in a way.
It is
descriptive in that sense.
Yeah, I love it for that reason. We've gone kind of far afield. What time is it? We've talked for quite a while. We probably need to wrap it up. But
it's been fascinating. It seems like the chat's really enjoyed it, which is nice. That's why we do it.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun with this kind of stuff. You have art here. So I'm going to link Matt's. I'm going to link Matt's one here again. Art. What I love about graphic novels, and I'm going to cut you out of the scene. You're still there, but they're not going to see your face, so I could show the art really big. Let me turn my light so maybe you can see this really good. Okay, so Matt's art is really good. This one is in it. He's shaking his head, but I'm going to tell you some great things about Matt's art that he himself will probably not say. So one of the things you'll notice when you get this book, and you should get all three. I think you're coming out with like an annotated edition of the first two. I have 2 copies each of the first 2. I don't know how I ended up with that, but I ended up with 2 copies.
I think that was me accidentally.
You accidentally sent me extra copies? All right, I can send some back to you if you want them. But anyway, notice that it's certain use of colors, right? So there's a color here. This is a scene at night. And what Matt does very well is he uses a limited and select color palette to heighten the mood and the telling of each single panel that you have. Each panel represents not just a moment but emotion that's going on in the comic tradition, or the whatever you want to call it, the illustrative tradition. You can see there's light coming in from behind, there's shadows, and all of these things are telling you where he's moving and what he's doing and what's going on. This is more than just something happened, but something is happening the way that it's presented. So all of this stuff is really good, and you should check it out in Matt's art. There's a lot that you can show in a single panel as far as emotion goes and things like that. You can actually broadcast lots of information in a single panel. It's why graphic novels are so efficient as far as storytelling, and why they translate so good into movies. So, like I said, I have this stuff. I have a lot of people on for crowdfunding that I don't actually buy their crowdfunded stuff, and it's nothing against them. It's not always a product I'm personally interested in. Matt's stuff is actually really good, and I do really like it. So, I do encourage you guys to check it out and buy it. I love his use of color in particular. The Kyrie comics are stylized for the most part, and you can see some of the style. This one has some different artists, but here you go. You can see the style that he works in as far as the way the figures and faces are constructed. It's more cartoonish maybe than, I don't know, kind of reminds me more of Tintin maybe than like American comics tradition. But the colors are really great, and there's such a full life to the way that he does the colors. There's different artists in these Wild Tales ones, which are pretty fun, including one by, I think, Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse has one in one of these. I love Jesse's
got
art too.
Anglo-Afghan War one. I actually got to color all of these, and it was fun to kind of give him a script.
Yeah, Matt's colors are just so good. Yeah, you guys can see that. So check it out. I do personally endorse these. A lot of times I'm just like, yeah, you can check it out. I don't necessarily personally like them, but I do like Matt's stuff a lot, so please give that a look. Let's take a look at the chat and answer the last stuff, and then I'll give you time to wrap up and do whatever spiel you want to do. Like David Stewart says, Christ, Pantocrator tells a story about Christ's nature and divinity. Yes. The famous Our Lady of Perpetual Help tells a story about Christ's birth with the angels present, with the way Christ is regarding you, and the way Mary is regarding you, that they're looking at you. They're not looking off to someone else. They're looking at you in the icon, and that matters too. St. Uriel has the flaming sword, so you would know him, if I'm correct. My own channel is kind of internet iconography. Yeah, it's like mimetic information flow. It's an idea that just gets encapsulated in an image. A lot of information can be conveyed in a single image. Matt made a Kyrie Laserdisc edition. Is this true? I must have missed this.
Oh, the chromium cover, yeah.
Oh, yeah, these are cool.
You have. Yeah.
These are cool. These came out really good. Other indie comics I've seen that had the shiny covers, like the covers were just awful, and like the book was printed terribly. Matt, I don't know what printer you use, but your books always come out really, like a really high quality print. I gotta say they're surprisingly good.
For those floppies, that was Kaplan. I highly recommend them. They do a lot of really good stuff, and it's not just chromium or it's flat, but you've got, that issue 1 has a radial chromium. There's a lava look for the second one. They have all different kinds of paper stocks, and they're always very professional. So.
Yeah, these are really, really cool books. And now let me look at some of the tiers. You're giving away some Roman coins. Do you have them? You have a bunch of pennies, or what did you get?
Yeah. No, I got them in the mail from Canada. Well, the fun thing is that they're different denominations. Some are more valuable than others. I just bought a lot, and so I'm gonna figure out. I'm gonna write a description of what everyone's getting. So I'm gonna date them all, figure out whose visage is on one side. So some people are gonna get more valuable points than others. I'm gonna make sure they're all high quality. So that was a fun thing. I always try to figure out, crowdfunding is a story. It's not just selling a book, but it's not just like a transactional thing, but you kind of have to have a narrative with what you're doing with crowdfunding. So I was like, what? I've done like these
those are cool.
Coder ring boxes from the previous campaign, and now I feel like I've kind of done 3D printing is done for me now. Like I made like ancient artifacts of my own. So like, how do I up the ante? I guess I'll just find some actual Roman coins and mail them to you. I don't know what I'm gonna do after this, but that's about as real as it gets.
Yeah, I think they're pretty cool. So, like Roman pennies and stuff, there's still a lot of them around. People are often surprised how many Roman coins are still floating around. They're like, how are they survived? It's like, well, they're made out of a durable material. There's a cat. Hello, cat. Copper and silver and gold are all durable materials. So they don't go anywhere unless you do something to them, right? So they'll last a good long time. What usually makes coins not survive is people melt them down for the metals that are in them to do different things with them. And this actually became a thing in, say, like medieval England. You had to turn in all your coins every 6 years to have them reminted, because people would shave silver off the sides of the coins, and then, so the coins steadily got less and less. They got smaller and smaller over the years. So I think, I'm trying to remember who did this. Who was the first one to do it? Henry the First, maybe. Got to turn your coins every 6 years to our royal mentors, and then we'll melt them down and we'll remint them. And we know that you are using the correct coins because they're this cycle's mint. But Roman coins didn't work that way, so they just stick around. People put them under their bed or whatever, and then eventually, they come down through the ages. We have gold coins from the Eastern Roman Empire still sticking around here. We find them in burial hoards from Vikings, which is really cool, because burial Viking hoards were one of those things where, hey, this is a great warrior, we got to bury him with stuff, so they just throw the treasures in there for us to find later. How kind of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, especially pennies, because kind of like our pennies, there's a whole lot of them. There's a lot of pennies floating around. So unless somebody destroys them for some reason, people hang on to them, and then you can buy them today. It's so amazing that you can still buy them. I think the hard ones to find are silver denarii. Those are the hard coins to find because they got melted down quite a bit.
Yeah. They're like $100 and up, I think.
Yeah.
For the cheap stuff.
They're cool to have, though, if you can find one. Find a couple Roman denarii. I don't have any Roman denarii. I have a couple Roman pennies floating around. There used to be a coin guy at the gun shows when I was a kid, and I always go buy different weird coins from him. Roman coins. So he had a bunch of like pennies from, some medieval country that got stuck around. I was like, man, they looked like crap. They're always like misstruck and like stuff like that. Like, they always look so bad. But what really mattered was if the weight of the metal was correct. The mint was just a guarantee that the weight was generally on. So they would put 1 ounce of silver and stamp it. Okay, I recognize that mint. That's the king, I think. There's probably an ounce of silver. But you might carry around your scales.
Like a wax seal, kind of. You're just putting a wax seal on a coin.
Yeah, that's it. Just lets people know that, somebody trustworthy weighed the coin at some point. So anyway, that's it. That's Kyrie. Anything else you'd like to? Any other messages to the future?
No, I was thrilled to have the opportunity to come on and hang out. If you like how I write, I'm working on some other stories. I am trying to explore different genres. I've always been interested in cyberpunk, and if that's something that's already been is it already a museum piece, or can we actually tell cyberpunk in 2022? So I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
So
there's some other stuff coming.
Yeah, like cyberpunk's an interesting thing because I think it's a great collection of aesthetics, and I think the aesthetic messaging is really good for cyberpunk. Which is not just people think like pink neon. There's more to it than that, right? Like, which is a humanity disturbed by the mechanical entering into it. I think you could still tell a lot of stories, but I think cyberpunk as a genre is in the retrofuturism category. You got to kind of step outside the box to tell stories with it. Like I've been playing Cyberpunk 2077, and mostly it feels like retrofuturism. It's like, here's the future as we imagined it would be in 1990. Problem is, we have that now. Like, I'm driving around Night City, and I drive out to the desert, and I'm like, this is just LA. I lived in LA. Like, I'm just playing Grand Theft Auto, but with slightly weirder looking cars, and people have stuff on their face that's not tattoos. So I don't know. I think you have to step outside the box with cyberpunk to tell something that's like really gonna knock people's socks off. But you can certainly tell good stories within the aesthetic frame of cyberpunk, and there's a lot of good messaging there with the mechanical intruding in on the human.
Yeah. I think that's been a really successful, and maybe that's because it was Eastern Europeans right with cyberpunk creating that game. So maybe that's why there's like a fresh intrusion perspective.
Yeah, maybe that's it too. It was done in Poland, You can
Yeah.
feel the modern West. I feel like there's intrusions of the modern Western perspective about like environmentalism and stuff onto it. But as soon as
Oh,
you
interesting.
kind of take it as a whole, like, yeah, there's some, like you go outside the city and there's Joshua trees. I'm like, okay, so looks, as soon as you drive out the I-15, it looks like this.
Yeah.
And then there's windmills, but the windmills are just like slightly different looking. They look more like they've just been abandoned for 100 years. I'm like, okay, yeah, it's kind of futurism, but it's kind of todayism. And we live in a world where we're spied on constantly by corporations that will stomp you into the dirt. But they don't do it with guns. They do it by just like, well, we just turned your bank account off because you suggested you might criticize a certain ethnic group. Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Alright.
Where's our Johnny?
Johnny Silverhand.
Yeah.
I don't know. What I love about the game, though, is they kind of embrace a retrofuturism thing. There's like flashbacks to Johnny Silverhand dying in like 2020. And you look at the world in 2020 and you're like, that kind of is the world in 2020, but people are more cybernetic. So it's the Cyberpunk 2020 tabletop game, which is made by Americans, an American, I'm forgetting his name. And then they just added, 50 some odd years to it and kind of did their own spin on it. It's kind of interesting. Very retrofuturistic, but it has a certain charm. It's like Flash Gordon, as far as the charm with it. The only problem I'll say with Cyberpunk 2077 is that it seems to celebrate it. It's unintentionally dystopic in some ways. I think the things that they're trying to play up as cool are actually very disturbing to me. And the things which are intended to be disturbing are also very disturbing. So the entire game is mostly very disturbing to me. And it portrays a world that I hate and I would hate to live in. But it's mostly because it's like our world on steroids, So even the things that they're kind of intending to be cool, like you can go up and hire a prostitute and there'll be a sex scene with the prostitute. I did this on accident and it like disgusted me. Because I'm like, I didn't want to have a little porno scene in the middle of this game. I just didn't want that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct. Zimamara says it's based off the tabletop game, which came out in like 1990.
1990. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay. That's authentic, right? That's it's got to be from 1990, or it's not. Not speaking from that authentic cyberpunk voice.
Yeah. Anyway, that's probably about it for today. We've talked for a good long while. I got to get to work on other things. Thanks for chatting with me, Matt. You could get Kyrie.
Yeah.
Oh, another ginger cat. I got one just like
Orange
him.
Cat Owners Unite.
Yeah. So you could get it. I have the first 2 books and Wild Tales. I ordered the 3rd one, so you guys can order that as well and check it out. I think it's already met its goal, so that's very good. Yep. But extra orders doesn't hurt. In fact, you got to 6,000. You were going to eat some fermented fish head soup or something if you got to $6,000.
Yeah, I'm gonna make the ancient Roman classic garum. I'm gonna find the most authentic recipe. I have hit it, so I got to do it now. And I'm gonna I hopefully live stream me making and eating it.
Oh, that's gonna be wild.
See what it's like. Yeah.
All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me this week. Hope you guys had fun with it today. God bless you all, and we'll see you next time. Have a great one.
See ya.